A cold blade swung through the air, and the legendary mercenary king was brutally decapitated on a blood-soaked battlefield. As his vision faded to black, his killer openly mocked him, revealing the sickening secret alliance that had systematically slaughtered his entire family. Swearing an oath of absolute, unfinished vengeance, his eyes suddenly snapped open. The smell of death was gone. His head was perfectly attached. He hadn't been captured or experimented on by enemy mages. He had somehow traveled back into the past. Armed with the perfect memories of the future, the useless trash master was gone. The ultimate game of bloody revenge begins right now. Memories of a man who was once uncontrollable, a sword master who had spent his days shut away in his room, flickered like shattered glass. He had been a man out of his mind, the useless oldest son of Count Perdium. That man was Ghislaine Perdium, the best knight of the north. Gasped for air, his face covered in blood as he struggled to understand how a garbage human being like Ghislaine could have defeated him. Walking through the burning wreckage of a battlefield, a hooded figure dragging a massive axe remarked that the fire felt warm and cozy, noting that he had invested a great deal of money into creating such a trap. The fallen knight looked up in shock, and the hooded man leaned in to ask if he liked the result. Trembling, the knight realized the identity of his conqueror, asking if he was truly that same garbage Ghislaine. He demanded to know if Ghislaine had known about his plans beforehand. Ghislaine explained that it was not just that. He had known the exact number of enemies, the identities of the spies, and even who had provided the reinforcements. Looking down at a set of nested dolls, Ghislaine stated that he had known everything from the very beginning. As his blue eye glowed with an eerie light, the knight refused to believe it. Ghislaine revealed that he had always been a hidden ace card. The knight roared in fury, wondering how a useless piece of shit could ever dare to do this to him, but Ghislaine silenced him with a brutal kick to the face. Standing amidst the flames, Ghislaine told the dying man to try invading as many times as he wanted, promising that he would be the one to win the war the next time, and every single time after that. He flashed a confident, sharp smile, explaining that he succeeded because he held all the plans. 1 year earlier, the scene shifted to the Luthania kingdom near the Perdium estate. Ghislaine woke up gasping for breath in a simple tent, wondering what had happened and if he was truly alive. He clutched his throat in disbelief, remembering that just moments ago he had been in a different place. In a chaotic memory of a setting sun, a massive sword had plummeted from the sky, shattering the earth. Ghislaine had lain on the ground, bloodied and broken, cursing his luck as the end drew near. Idun, the noble knight and one of the 7 strongest men on the continent, had stood over him, declaring that the war was finally over. When asked for his last words, the dying mercenary king Ghislaine Perdium replied that he had none, though he felt it was a shame he could not fulfill his revenge. Idun called him arrogant, pressing a blade against his throat and expressing surprise that the mercenary king was actually the oldest son of the fallen Perdium household who had fled after his sister's death. Ghislaine questioned how a man from a different kingdom could possibly know such private family history. Idun reached out a hand, explaining that he had worked tirelessly to track Ghislaine down because he and his allies had collaborated with the Delphine household to destroy the Perdium family. Ghislaine realized with horror that there were others behind the fall of his home besides Duke Delphine. Idun dismissed his questions, telling him to accept his fate since he would be dead soon anyway. Ghislaine screamed that he would never forgive the man, but Idun remained unmoved, and with a clean strike, he decapitated the mercenary king. Back in the present, Ghislaine touched his neck, marveling at the fact that his head was still on his shoulders despite the memory of his execution. He looked into a barrel of water and saw a younger version of himself staring back, wondering if it had all been a hallucination. He questioned if he had been taken captive and used as an experiment by mages, but then he spotted his sword and vowed to make those arrogant bastards regret keeping him alive. Suddenly, a soldier named Ricardo burst into the tent, calling out for the young master and asking him to come outside since he knew he was awake. Ghislaine immediately lunged forward, pressing a blade to the soldier's throat and commanding him to stay quiet, promising to let him live if he answered his questions. His eyes glowed with intensity as he considered the possibility of killing the man, but Ricardo merely looked annoyed, asking if the young master thought he was crossing a line and insisting that a no was a no. Ghislaine was baffled by the lack of fear, realizing the man was being threatened and yet seemed totally unfazed. Ricardo asked what he was talking about and explained that Ghislaine had simply tired himself out from a tantrum and fallen asleep. Ghislaine was shocked to hear he had thrown a fit, but Ricardo told him to pack his things because the others were waiting. When Ghislaine asked where they were going, Ricardo replied that they were heading to the Perdium estate. Ghislaine grabbed him, demanding he say that again, unable to believe the estate was not fallen. As they walked toward the distant castle, Ghislaine realized it truly was the Perdium estate, standing intact when he had last seen it reduced to ashes. Ricardo joked that he must have had a nightmare to call his own home a fallen household, warning him that the Count would kick him out for saying such things. Ghislaine pinched his cheek hard, and the sharp pain confirmed he was not dreaming. Seeing his younger face in the thriving estate, he realized he had traveled back to the past. He remembered how his younger self had been filled with resentment and inferiority. which led to constant trouble and caused his family to avoid him. Eventually, he had been unable to take the criticism and ran away, becoming a mercenary and building a reputation through years of war. By the time he had returned to fix his mistakes, the county had already been destroyed. He had lost everything, but now, it was all back. Seeing the white wolf flag, he felt an overwhelming urge to sing for joy, yet he knew it was too early to celebrate. He asked Ricardo if they were there to raid orcs, and Ricardo confirmed that day was one he could never forget. Ghislaine knew that in his past life, this was the day most of the raid squad had died. He had joined them to make a name for himself, believing the report that there were only 3 orcs, but his lack of experience and stubbornness had led the squad into a massacre when 20 orcs appeared. He realized the orcs would be easy to handle without their strategy, but he worried the men would not trust a man they considered a useless bastard. Suddenly, the camp was thrown into chaos as a watchtower was smashed to pieces. Soldiers screamed that the orcs were there. Ghislaine was stunned by the speed of the attack, wondering if they had been this fast in his previous life as the monsters began slaughtering the men. The raid squad commander, Scoven, charged forward, shouting for the men to get into a defense formation and not to panic. An orc's massive blade sent soldiers flying, and Scoven realized they were being ambushed while unprepared. He saw there were far more orcs than reported and feared they would all die. A soldier screamed a warning as a giant orc loomed behind the commander with a raised axe. Just before the blow landed, Ghislaine grabbed Scoven and pulled him to safety. Scoven looked back in confusion, and before he could process what was happening, Ghislaine lunged forward with his sword. With a single, fluid motion, he sliced through the orc's neck, sending its head spinning into the air. Blood sprayed across the battlefield as the massive body collapsed. Ghislaine clicked his tongue, frustrated that he could not yet use mana and wishing he had returned even earlier. He looked at the stunned Scoven and confirmed he was the commander before reaching out his hand. He demanded that Scoven hand over the commander rights, his blue eyes filled with a cold, unshakable authority. Standing firm on the blood-soaked earth, Ghislaine demanded the right to command the squad. Scoven, the raid commander, stared back in disbelief, his mind racing with the thought that Ghislaine was a fool for asking for such authority when the lives of their soldiers hung in the balance. With a firm, unwavering tone, Scoven refused the request, leaving Ghislaine momentarily stunned. The commander barked at him, asking if he thought this life-and-death struggle was some kind of game, and insisted that he could not simply hand over the authority the Lord had granted him. Ghislaine looked away, finding the situation annoying, yet he privately admitted that he would have reacted the same way if an idiot had approached him with such a demand. The tension was shattered by a massive, red-skinned orc charging toward them with a roar. Scoven lunged forward, ordering Ghislaine to fall back and leave the fighting to the experienced soldiers. Seeing the chaos unfolding, Ghislaine realized he had no choice but to take matters into his own hands. He moved with a speed Scoven didn't expect, and the commander cried out in anger, demanding to know what he was doing. In a flash, Ghislaine's sword struck true, piercing the orc's eye and leaving the beast howling in agony. Scoven froze, his eyes wide as he wondered how the young master had managed to strike the monster's weak spot so perfectly. Ghislaine turned back to him, asking if he knew the most important factor in a battle. He looked toward the line of soldiers, who were trembling behind their shields as the orcs closed in, and noted that there was no hope for victory when the troops were consumed by fear. He declared that they needed to gain momentum, his eyes burning with a sudden, lethal intensity. With a powerful leap, Ghislaine launched himself into the fray, his blade descending like a guillotine into the skull of another beast. Scoven watched, paralyzed by shock, as the young man challenged the entire orc pack to come at him. Ghislaine roared a promise to kill them all, his movements becoming a blur of crimson and steel as he danced through the enemy ranks, severing limbs and heads with terrifying precision. Scoven felt as if he were trapped in a dream, knowing that even for a trained mana user, such a feat was nearly impossible, yet this slender youth was tearing through the battlefield. He could see the fatigue beginning to weigh on Ghislaine's body, but the young master's technique remained flawless. He used the smallest possible movements to dodge lethal strikes and countered by hitting every vital point, looking like a manaless swordmaster or something even more formidable. Ghislaine taunted the monsters, laughing that he was not even warmed up yet and mocking their reputation as a warrior species. As the orcs focused all their rage on him, the soldiers watched in confusion, wondering if the young master was running away. Scoven's heart hammered against his ribs as he questioned Ghislaine's plan, noting that while drawing their attention was brilliant, he was now sprinting toward the edge of a sheer cliff. Suddenly, the realization hit the commander like a physical blow. He understood the strategy and roared for his troops to raise a shield wall and follow the first son's lead. Ghislaine glanced back, trusting that a skilled commander like Scoven would see the opportunity. He knew his current, weak stamina wouldn't allow him to finish them all alone, but he had done enough to set the stage. As he reached the precipice, Ghislaine saw the shield wall locking into place and smiled, whispering that it was perfect. He threw himself off the cliff's edge just as Scoven gave the order to push. The soldiers surged forward with a collective cry, their shields slamming into the orc pack and sending the monsters tumbling into the abyss. The beasts plummeted to the jagged rocks below, their bodies shattering upon impact. The soldiers collapsed in exhaustion, panting as they realized they had actually survived and wiped out the entire group. They scrambled to the edge, calling out for the young master in a panic, only to find find Ghislaine dangling precariously from his sword, which he had driven into the cliffside. He looked up at them with a weary gaze, his grip failing as his strength finally gave out. Scovin reached down, desperate for him to hold on, but Ghislaine felt his fingers slip. He plummeted into the white void of the mist below. As darkness took him, a soft, familiar voice echoed in his mind, calling out to him. It was Elena. Visions of his sister flashed before his eyes, memories of her crying for their mother, thanking him with a bright smile, and scolding him for his foolishness. He realized these were his most precious memories of the girl he had lost. In the vision, a young Elena grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with desperation as she begged him to go with her. Ghislaine's eyes snapped open. He found himself lying in a bed with a wet cloth on his forehead, realized he was alive and that the soldiers must have saved him from the fall. He sat up with a groan, his entire body screaming in pain from the extreme limits he had pushed during the fight. A maid hurried into the room, her face lighting up with relief as she saw he was awake. Ghislaine recognized her instantly as Belinda, his personal tutor and the only person who had stayed by his side throughout his past life's failures. He remembered how she had vanished after their family fell to ruin, and he felt a surge of emotion at seeing her again. Belinda began to scold him for his recklessness, telling him he should have let the soldiers handle the orcs, but Ghislaine simply pulled her into a sudden hug. He whispered that he was just glad to see her, confusing the poor girl. Knowing the future, Ghislaine decided he needed to tell her the truth. He gripped her shoulders and warned her that a catastrophe would soon strike the Perdium estate. When she looked at him with skepticism, he confessed that he had died and come back to life. Belinda didn't believe a word of it, dismissing his claim as a delusion caused by his near-death experience with the orcs. She continued to nag him, warning that his antics would land him in jail and asking if he intended to be too injured to attend the festival. Ghislaine froze at the mention of a festival. Belinda reminded him that Lady Elena had been waiting for the day they could go to the festival together, noting that it was a chance for the siblings to become close again. Ghislaine looked at a framed picture of himself and Elena, remembering that in his past life, he had never enjoyed such things because of his trauma. He asked how much time remained, and Belinda told him he had about a week left. A cold dread settled in Ghislaine's chest as he realized that the day that had haunted him for a lifetime was fast approaching. In exactly 1 week, Elena was destined to die. Standing in the center of the room, Ghislaine pulled Elena into a sudden, tight hug. The young girl struggled against his grip, asking what was wrong with him and what kind of prank he was playing. Ghislaine ignored her protests, softly admitting that he had simply missed her. Elena shoved him away with surprising force, calling him creepy and demanding he let her go. Ghislaine stumbled back, coughing as he realized she possessed incredible strength for a child, wondering if she had always been this powerful. Elena glared at him, explaining that Belinda had only asked her to be there and questioned what kind of game he was playing, asking if he really thought a hug made everything okay. Ghislaine looked confused, asking what was supposed to be okay. Elena yelled that she had told him to piss off because he was annoying, and even his breath felt disgusting to her. She was furious that he seemed to have forgotten the terrible things he had said to her. Ghislaine realized with a pang of guilt that he had been a complete piece of shit to her in his past life. He quietly offered a sincere apology, which left both Elena and Belinda frozen in shock. They could not believe he had apologized first, and Elena wondered aloud if an orc had hit him in the head. Ghislaine insisted that he had defeated all the orcs, but as he stepped toward them, his body seized up in pain. Elena mocked him, suggesting that if he really got them all, he would not have come back unconscious and in such a state. Watching them, Ghislaine realized everyone was exactly as he remembered. He regretted how much time his past self had wasted on useless things. He remembered the festival from his previous life, where he had rejected Elena's offer to go together, using his frustration with the raid squad as an excuse. That had been the last time he ever saw her alive. Her body had been found shredded to pieces along with her guards, and the memory of her screaming for him haunted his mind. He vowed that this time, he would be with her. Jamal and Philip, her 2 bodyguards, arrived to escort her, and Elena asked why they had entered when she told them to wait outside. They apologized, explaining that the servants needed her to oversee the festival supplies. Ghislaine wondered why they would ask a young girl for help, and Belinda explained that there was such a shortage of workers that even Elena had to work, mostly because Ghislaine spent all his time lazing around. Ghislaine felt a pang of realization that he had never cared about the estate's affairs before. When Elena turned to leave, Ghislaine surprised everyone by volunteering to help. Elena and Belinda exchanged a look of pure disbelief, convinced he had truly suffered a head injury. In the busy marketplace, Ghislaine tried to assist the servants, but they flinched away, telling him to go away because people were too scared to work with him around. He asked if that was really how they treated someone who wanted to help, but a maid told him the best way to help was to stay out of their way and out of trouble. Ghislaine did not mind the rejection. He needed to know the castle's layout perfectly. He knew Elena's body would eventually be found near the slums, far from the festival grounds, and suspected someone would forcibly move her there. Suddenly, a knight in blue armor called out to him. Ghislaine recognized the face of old man Fergus, a loyal servant who had rushed to his side after hearing about the orc attack. Ghislaine brushed off the concern, but Elena joked that the old man should take him back to his room because he was acting weird. Ghislaine realized his reputation as a hooligan was getting in his way. He decided to use the following week to scout the castle and asked Fergus to bring him to an abandoned training field. Fergus was confused but led him to a large, well-maintained stone hall. Ghislaine was impressed by its condition, and Fergus explained that they had kept it maintained just in case he ever decided to use it. Ghislaine felt a deep regret, realizing how much the people around him had actually cared for him. He told Fergus that he needed to live a long life because dying felt like shit. Fergus noted that he was acting like someone who had already experienced life and death, and Ghislaine smiled, admitting that he actually had died and been resurrected. Fergus dismissed it as tomfoolery and left him to his training. Ghislaine realized he had been short-sighted to treat everyone as enemies. He knew that in his past life, a neighboring lord had been behind Alina's death to spark a war that destroyed the Perdium house. He sat in the center of the hall, determined to set things straight. His first goal was to regain his physique and master mana once more. He visualized the mana particles in the air, bundling them together like thread on a spool. For a man who had survived tens of thousands of battles, creating a mana core was easy. However, he pushed himself further, using a method from a forbidden book to create a second and third core, linking them into a mesh for explosive power. The strain was immense, causing him to cough up blood, but he managed to stabilize 3 cores. He knew this instability had cost him his life against Idun before, but with a youthful body and more time, he vowed to take Idun's head and destroy the traitors behind House Delphine. 1 week later, the night of the festival arrived. Ghislaine strapped on his gear and walked through the lively streets. Elena was stunned to see him, noting that he never attended such events. Ghislaine claimed that as a Perdium, he should show his face occasionally. Elena mentioned how odd he had been acting, doing nothing but training for a week. She teased him, remembering how he used to complain about their father and wish he were the Lord. Then, she smiled warmly, telling him she liked the way things were now and that it felt like the old Ghislaine was back. Ghislaine looked at her, realizing that his actions were already changing the future. He watched as Belinda and the guards interacted with the crowds, knowing that while the general flow of history remained, his small choices were creating ripples. He felt prepared for whatever was coming. As the night went on, Elena enjoyed the festivities, but Ghislaine remained alert, noticing that nothing bad had happened yet. One of the bodyguards approached Elena, suggesting they check out a new event elsewhere. Elena was excited and grabbed the guard's hand, running toward the darker parts of the festival. Ghislaine watched them go with cold, narrowed eyes. He had found them. Jamal and Philip were the traitors of the house, and they were leading his sister straight into a trap. Alina's escort knights, Jamal and Philip, were once the most trusted protectors in the feud because they had guarded her since she was a child. In Ghislaine's past life, it was believed they were murdered while trying to defend her, but now, staring at them with cold, knowing eyes, he realized the truth. They were the traitors of his house. As they reached a secluded, grimy alleyway, the group came to a halt. Elena looked around in disappointment, questioning why there was nothing there and asking if a performance would really take place in such a dirty location. Philip brushed it off, suggesting the performers weren't prepared yet, but promised people would arrive soon. Ghislaine remained silent, his gaze scanning the environment. As he expected, the alley may have seemed like a simple deserted street at first sight, but the placement of obstacles blocking every escape route proved that preparations had been made in advance. Sensing the danger, Elena grabbed Ghislaine's arm and told her big brother it was time to go, refusing to watch a show in such a place. Jamal and Philip moved to block their path. Philip reached out a hand, calling her young lady and telling her to wait just a little longer, his face twisted into a grotesque, shadowed expression. Elena shivered, whispering Philip's name as she realized they were acting strange. She demanded to know what was the matter with them today. Jamal laughed, claiming he didn't mean to scare her. It was just that a very reasonable request had come in. Elena gasped as the gravity of the situation hit her. From the shadows, a man named Frank stepped forward, flanked by 2 hooded figures. He tipped his hat, noting that the work process was remarkably clean. Jamal bowed, confirming they had brought the young lady as promised and asking to end the deal right there. Frank's eyes narrowed behind his sunglasses as he spotted Ghislaine, noting that he hadn't requested the eldest son of Perdium be brought there. Jamal smirked, offering to hand Ghislaine over for free, mocking the boy for foolishly following them to what would become his graveyard. Ghislaine looked at Jamal and asked if he really thought he could get away with selling them out. Jamal laughed in his face, telling Ghislaine to worry about himself first. He explained that they were simply tired of the impoverished land and the constant threat of barbarians, and they planned to run away to a faraway place. He claimed plenty of others were leaving Perdium anyway. Ghislaine's expression darkened as he noted that while others might leave, they at least never sold the family out. Before Jamal could react, Ghislaine lunged forward, his blade driving clean through the knight's chest. Jamal gasped, blood bubbling at his lips as he stared in shock. Ghislaine's blue eyes flared with lethal intent as he asked if Jamal truly thought he was safe. Philip screamed in rage, calling Jamal an idiot and wondering how a trained knight could lose to an amateur. He lunged at Ghislaine, but the young master was faster. Ghislaine's blade pierced upward through Philip's head, killing him instantly. Frank watched the scene with a calculating look, questioning if this was really the eldest son of Perdium, as he had heard the boy had no combat experience or fundamental training. He noted that despite being taken off guard, Ghislaine had instantly killed 2 knights using attacks reinforced with mana. Elena trembled, clinging to Ghislaine and asking what was happening. Ghislaine looked at her briefly before pressing a finger to her neck, telling her to take a little rest. As she slumped unconscious in his arms, Frank spoke up, thanking Ghislaine for doing their work for them by taking care of those two. He remarked that Ghislaine was much different from the rumors and asked if he had been hiding his true skills. Ghislaine stood over the corpses, asking why any of that mattered to a man who was about to die. He pulled his sword from the ground, analyzing the remaining 3 enemies. The 2 hooded subordinates were nothing, but the man in the center, Frank, exuded a level of mana that was on a different level. Ghislaine knew he had to end this quickly. He asked whose request this was, but Frank merely smiled, asking if there was a need for a dead man to know. Ghislaine didn't care for the answer, noting that he knew Frank wouldn't talk easily, but promised he would want to spill it soon enough. Frank dismissed the threat, ordering his men to capture Ghislaine alive, break every limb in his body, and leave him to writhe in pain until he went mad. He wanted the scene to be beautiful. The 2 assassins charged. Ghislaine reached into his pocket and threw a firecracker. The sudden explosion blinded one of the men, and Ghislaine moved like a phantom, his blade carving through the man's face. He called it a shallow trick as he parried the second assassin's strike and countered with a lethal blow. As the second hooded man fell, Frank moved with blinding speed, attempting a perfect sneak attack from Ghislaine's blind spot. Ghislaine managed to block the strike, though the force pushed him back. Frank was genuinely surprised, noting that Ghislaine had blocked his attack even from that position. Their blades locked, and Ghislaine's counterstrike managed to slice Frank's pipe in half and nick his neck. Ghislaine was shocked to see that Frank had survived a direct strike to the throat, realizing the man had focused a dense amount of mana around his neck to reduce the damage. Frank chuckled, admitting he was surprised and noting that if he had lacked mana, he would have been beheaded. He stared at Ghislaine with a predatory grin, admitting he had no clue how the boy had learned such strange swordsmanship at his age, but declared with absolute certainty that Ghislaine would die right there. Ghislaine did not respond with words. Instead, a sharp, confident smile played on his lips. Frank was taken aback by the expression, wondering why the boy was smiling. Ghislaine moved with a lethal grace, maneuvering around the assassin's guard. Frank ignored the movement at first, certain that no amount of skill could compensate for the gap in their mana. Suddenly, Frank coughed up a mouthful of blood. He stumbled back, gasping in disbelief as he realized the power behind Ghislaine's last strike was completely different from before. He could not comprehend how a boy of Ghislaine's level could pierce through his mana-enhanced defense. Looking down at the struggling man, Ghislaine noted that he had never expected to find a true culprit behind Alina's death so soon. He walked forward, his body beginning to pulse with an oppressive purple aura. He told Frank to prepare himself as he unleashed his third core. Frank's eyes went wide behind his sunglasses, terrified by the sudden and massive surge of mana. He demanded to know how the youth had boosted his power so greatly. Ghislaine did not give him time to think, lunging forward with a speed that left Frank reeling. Frank struggled to block the onslaught, his hands turning numb just from the impact of Ghislaine's strikes. He realized that while drawing mana usually had a limited effect, this method was explosive and unheard of. To Frank, it felt as if Ghislaine had transformed into an entirely different person. With a final crushing blow, Ghislaine shattered Frank's sword into fragments. He followed through with a brutal strike that sent the assassin screaming in agony. Ghislaine seized the man by the throat, hoisting him up and demanding to know who had requested the hit. Frank groaned, coughing more blood, but tried to insist he would not go down that easily. He surreptitiously drew a small dagger, intending to take the unconscious Elena with him, but his hand froze in midair. Thin, glowing threads of mana had wrapped around his body, pinning him in place. Ghislaine told him not to try anything useless and offered a deal, suggesting that if Frank answered his questions, he would sheath his sword. Frank was paralyzed with fear, wondering when Ghislaine had set such a trap. Ghislaine noted that someone of Frank's caliber likely knew how to patch himself up, but warned it would not matter if he destroyed Frank's mana core. Frank watched in horror as his mana began to scatter and backflow. He screamed, asking if Ghislaine was out of his mind, knowing that one wrong move could cause a massive explosion that would blow the entire area away. He accused Ghislaine of planning to self-destruct, but Ghislaine coldly replied that such a tactic was for the unskilled and that he could manage the power perfectly. Seeing the look of absolute death in Ghislaine's eyes, Frank realized the boy was not bluffing. Terrified of dying, he screamed out the truth, revealing that Count Desmond was the one who had requested this. He explained that Desmond needed a pretext to start a war against the Perdium and Degard families. Ghislaine absorbed the information, finally understanding the architect of his home's downfall. In his past life, such underground work was hidden by those allied with Duke Delphine. He asked if that was why they wanted to kill Elena, and Frank confirmed it with a desperate cry. Ghislaine's grip tightened, causing Frank to gasp and ask what he was doing, complaining that this treatment was different from their earlier conversation. Ghislaine brushed off the man's cowardice, noting that Frank had killed plenty in his time yet was scared when it was his turn to die. Frank laughed manically through his pain, claiming that nothing would change because he had already finished the setup with the Degard heir. He spat that no one would listen to a punk like Ghislaine and that Perdium would perish in the coming war. Ghislaine leaned in, telling the dying man that since he was reborn after death, everything would be different this time. He unleashed a violent pillar of mana that illuminated the night sky, vaporizing what remained of his enemies. enemy. Ghislaine stood alone in the alley, his blades shaking in his hands. He looked over at the sleeping Elena, relieved she was unharmed. He dropped his sword, the metallic clang echoing in the silence as he exhaled a long breath. However, the strain of the 3 cores took its toll. He spat blood and collapsed to his knees, swearing that he would not fall like this despite the mounting agony. He acknowledged that exploding 3 cores was not an issue as a mercenary king, but his current body was struggling to cope. Staggering toward a nearby pile of debris, Ghislaine pushed open a door and found the body of the son of Degard. He realized the assassins had killed the boy and intended to frame him and his knight as Alina's killers to spark the war. Determined to stop the enemy's plans, Ghislaine decided it was time to erase this evidence. He gathered his strength and lifted Elena onto his back, vowing that he would not let things happen as they intended. He walked out of the burning alleyway, unaware that a mysterious hooded figure was watching him from a nearby tree. Deep within a dimly lit chamber, a secret council met to discuss a mission that had ended in total failure. They had sent guard knights and Frank, the very best operative they had, yet the mission had been thwarted. One member of the council demanded to know how they could have failed to secure just one girl, asking if they had let their guard down because they assumed it would be easy work. Kneeling in the center of the room, a hooded messenger trembled as he struggled to find the words, eventually stammering out that their failure was entirely due to Ghislaine Perdium. The name caused a ripple of confusion and disdain through the group, as they questioned how that useless bastard of the north could be responsible. One man clutched his hand in frustration, reminding the messenger that everyone was well aware Ghislaine was nothing but a useless piece of shit and accusing him of using the boy as an easy excuse. The messenger insisted that Ghislaine had been completely different from any of the information or rumors they possessed. In his mind, he replayed the memory of the young master's lethal speed, the way he had carved through the assassins with glowing purple mana, and the terrifying look in his eyes as he stood amidst the flames. To the messenger, it was as if Ghislaine had become a completely different person. He pointed out that they had already taken care of things with Degard, so the failure would not prevent the territorial war from starting, and he begged for just one more chance to fix the situation. The leader told him to shut it, furious that he had caused such a massive setback despite the easy nature of the mission. As the council members ordered his elimination, a deep, resonant voice cut through the noise, telling them how noisy they were being. The council fell silent as a shadowy figure seated on a massive throne asked the messenger what kind of chance he wanted. The messenger promised that he would personally get rid of Ghislaine Perdium by making a duel happen naturally. He revealed that he had someone specific in mind for the task, a man named Cain Loges. Cain was famous for his overwhelming, strength-based swordsmanship and was considered the epitome of power despite his youth, with no one in the north able to match him. He added that since Cain and Ghislaine were cousins, it would be easy to orchestrate a meeting between them. The figure on the throne remained silent for a long moment before warning the messenger that if he failed again, there would be no next time. The messenger bowed low, vowing that he would not disappoint. Back at the Perdium castle, Fergus approached the training hall, informing the young master that it was approaching mealtime. Suddenly, a flash of blue light tore through the air as Ghislaine's sword was thrown with incredible force, pinning the old man's cape to the wall. Fergus was momentarily stunned by the speed and precision of the attack, asking how Ghislaine had managed such a feat. Ghislaine explained that he had used a mana thread, essentially using his power like a string to manipulate the blade. He admitted that in his past life he had used many threads at once, but with his current limited mana, he had to settle for a single thread to reduce the cost. Fergus was bewildered, noting that just a short while ago Ghislaine had never even bothered to train, let alone develop such advanced techniques. He wondered how the boy had come up with the idea of using mana threads so suddenly. Ghislaine simply thanked Fergus for protecting Elena, which left the old knight speechless with shock. When Fergus asked why he was being thanked, Ghislaine replied that it was just something he should have done and suggested they head out to eat. A few days passed, and the festival was officially paused. It made sense to the people, given that a guard knight had been caught trying to traffic the young lady of the house. During dinner, Elena leaned on her hand with a bored expression, complaining that everyone believed she was lying when she claimed Ghislaine was the one who had saved her. She urged him to go say something to the people, but Ghislaine finished his meal calmly, noting that they likely wouldn't believe it anyway. Belinda grew furious at the memory of Jamal and Philip, clenching her fists and calling them perverts for trying to kidnap a child. Ghislaine watched his sister, relieved that she was alive and that he had managed to stop the war from happening, yet he knew the enemies would not give up. He realized he could not stop them on his own forever and needed to grow a substantial military force, which meant he would have to involve himself in politics. As a servant placed a small, simple piece of bread on his plate, Ghislaine stared at it in confusion, asking Belinda why they were being served dessert first. Belinda replied with a tired look, asking if he was aware of their current situation. Suddenly, a massive roar of protest erupted from outside the castle windows. A mob of merchants had gathered at the gates, screaming for compensation for the damages caused by the cancellation of the festival. They shouted for the people inside to come out, accusing the family of swimming in money while they suffered. Ghislaine looked out at the aggressive crowd, wondering what the hell was going on. Belinda explained that the county was full of merchants who relied on the profits from the festival to survive through the year, so their fury was understandable given it was cancelled after only one day. Ghislaine realized the situation in the county was far worse than he had thought and knew the mob would only get more aggressive passive if he did nothing. He asked Fergus to send soldiers to calm the crowd, but the old knight regretfully informed him that they had none. He explained that most of the garrison had been dispatched to the Forest of Monsters to assist with reconstruction following the orc raid. Ghislaine cursed his luck, realizing the military was stretched thin. A map of the territory showed that Perdium was eternally at war, caught between the barbarians at the North Fortress and the constant monster threats from the forest. With no money and no soldiers, the situation was a mess. Ghislaine pulled Belinda aside and asked if she was the one who managed his personal funds, hoping to use them to appease the merchants. Belinda laughed at the suggestion, informing him that there wasn't a single coin left. When he asked why, she reminded him that the Count had cut off his allowance because he used to spend money like water. Realizing he was broke, Ghislaine felt a surge of desperation, knowing that even with future knowledge, he could do nothing without a basic amount of money. He stood by the window, wondering if there was anything left on the estate to use, when Ricardo suddenly burst into the room in a blind panic. He gasped that there was a problem and that the young master Cain Loges wished to see Ghislaine. Before Ghislaine could even look toward the door, a massive explosion of violence erupted as Cain's fist slammed into Fergus with a deafening impact. The old knight was sent flying back, coughing up blood and groaning in agony. Ghislaine watched as his cousin stepped into the room, his massive, muscular frame filling the doorway. Cain stared at Ghislaine with an arrogant smirk, greeting him simply by saying, "Hey, Ghislaine." Ghislaine knew that face. It was the heir of Loges County, a family with whom his own held a long-standing alliance. Cain Loges had been his only friend back then, yet he had also been his greatest enemy. Cain stepped over the bruised and bloodied body of Fergus, his presence suffocating the room. Ghislaine turned his gaze toward Ricardo, asking for an explanation of the situation. Trembling, Ricardo explained that they had responded to a reported disturbance at a tavern where they found Cain and his escort knight. Recognizing the Perdium men, Cain had demanded to know if the rumors about Ghislaine's sudden prowess were true. When Commander Scovin attempted to explain the details, Cain had reacted with explosive violence. A memory of the tavern flashbacked into Ricardo's mind, showing Cain grabbing Scovin by the face and lifting him off the ground. Cain had roared, asking how a lowly commander dared to lie before the heir of Loges. Back in the present, Ricardo stood battered and shaken while Cain stepped forward, telling him to speak the truth if he intended to tell the story at all. Cain explained that Scovin had claimed that Ghislaine, a man who never even trained, had supposedly defeated an orc with his bare hands and handled traitorous knights alone. Laughing, Cain admitted he had simply given the commander a little wake-up call to knock some sense into him. Towering over his cousin, Cain remarked that none of this would have happened if they hadn't lied in the first place. Ghislaine remained silent, looking into Cain's eyes and remembering exactly what kind of man he was. Cain had always treated him like a subordinate, making a mess every time he visited Perdium. Because of Ghislaine's past inferiority complex, he had never stood up to him, and the court often praised Cain's bold demeanor as a quality befitting an heir, while criticizing Ghislaine further. Cain watched him, wondering why the boy hadn't charged at him yet despite the blatant provocation. A short while ago, within the walls of Loges County, a shadowy messenger had proposed a lethal task. Cain had questioned the order to kill his own cousin, but the messenger promised that the esteemed power they served would support the Loges family if he succeeded. Cain had noted that it was an easy task to handle a punk like Ghislaine, but pointed out that killing another heir was complicated. The messenger suggested luring Ghislaine into a duel to make it appear like a trivial accident, promising to accompany Cain disguised as an escort knight. Calling it an uncommon opportunity, the messenger had successfully tempted Cain. Cain had agreed immediately, noting that while it was a shame to kill his cousin, he would go right away to finish it. Back in the reality of the castle room, Ghislaine's eyes narrowed. He wondered if they were trying to eliminate him now that he had begun to change. He saw his chance. Cain demanded to know why he was standing still, telling him to bring the usual things that were always prepared for his visits. Ghislaine questioned what he meant by prepared, and Cain laughed, suggesting they should liven up the mood since the festival was interrupted. He claimed they were always in sync, asking if he was wrong. Ghislaine realized he was talking about the alcohol and women his past self once squandered the family's funds on to avoid a beating. He looked at his cousin and realized that this was his solution. It was his source of money. Ghislaine kept his face calm, suggesting he would go get those things right now. However, he paused and asked if Cain didn't have a debt to repay first. Cain looked confused, asking what he was supposed to repay. Ghislaine explained that he had been handling every expensive request Cain ever made with his own personal money, and he was now settling the debt for 1,000 gold, including principal and interest. Cain was outraged, shouting that those things shouldn't have cost even 100 gold. He insisted that Ghislaine had done it because they were friends, calling the past expenses a friendship fee. Ghislaine's smile widened into something dark and mocking. He spat back that he had been Cain's doormat for far too long, and he demanded the money before he beat the hell out of him. He thought to himself that he needed a great deal of money very soon. The room fell into a stunned silence, and Ricardo wondered what the young master was saying. Cain sighed, his expression shifting from amusement to cold fury. He noted that Ghislaine was acting bold just because he had been going easy on him, accusing him of believing his own false rumors. He called Ghislaine a parasite leeching off the land and a scoundrel that everyone in the north looked down upon. Telling him to get himself together, Cain threw a massive, heavy punch. Ghislaine dodged the strike with ease, moving into his cousin's guard. He landed a stinging punch to Kane's solar plexus, then another direct blow to his face. Kane gasped, blood spraying from his mouth as he stumbled back. The crowd in the room watched in disbelief, wondering if Ghislaine had truly just beaten his cousin. Kane collapsed to the ground, but Ghislaine wasn't fooled, telling him to get up and stop whining because he knew the shot had been blocked. The hooded escort knight stepped in, ordering Ghislaine to stand back and asking what he thought he was doing. Ghislaine laughed quietly, realizing the two were acting. In a low whisper, Kane asked his escort how his acting was, and the messenger replied that it was excellent. They had perfectly set the stage to make Ghislaine look like the aggressor, which was more than enough to justify a duel. Kane felt confident that this was the perfect time to cut off the falling power of the Perdium family. He stood up and began putting on a combat glove, shouting for everyone to hear that Ghislaine had tarnished the dignity of nobility by attacking him for simply trying to verify the truth. He started to issue a formal challenge, but Ghislaine interrupted him with a sharp gesture. Ghislaine declared that he was the one challenging Kane Loges to a duel. He pointed out that Kane had insulted the heir of the land in front of the people and assaulted a loyal knight, tarnishing the dignity of the nobility himself. Ghislaine leaned in, his blue eyes cold and predatory, asking if Kane intended to deny his actions. Kane smiled, noting that while he knew his cousin was stupid, he didn't know he was stupid enough to dig his own grave. He accepted the duel, warning Ghislaine not to regret it even if he ended up dead. Ghislaine remained unbothered, calling out to Ricardo. When the soldier responded, Ghislaine gave him a surprising set of orders. He told Ricardo to bring all the merchants who were protesting in front of the castle. With a sharp, calculating smile, he told Ricardo to tell those merchants that he was about to make them some big money. The festival was suddenly cancelled, and the atmosphere that had heated up to its peak suddenly cooled down, leaving behind tourists who could not return home out of regret. They remained in a state of incomplete combustion, as they were not able to spend their money or time. In such a situation, if an event were to take place to soothe them, it would be met with frantic enthusiasm, and Ghislaine stood ready to provide exactly that. A thunderous roar of excitement filled the air as the announcer declared a duel between young Master Kane and Ghislaine. The crowd went wild, screaming for everyone to bet their money on young Master Kane, convinced that the damned punk Ghislaine was finally going to get what he deserved. In the makeshift marketplace, merchants yelled that things were cheap and urged people to buy one and get one free while taking a look at the odds. A fat merchant sat at a table, frantically writing as people lined up to bet their money on Kane, calling it the guaranteed safest bet. Kane Loges slammed his massive broadsword into the stone floor with a deafening crack, asking how Ghislaine dared to turn a sacred duel into a marketplace like this. He stared down at his cousin with a predatory glint in his eyes, making it clear before they started that his sword would not stop even if Ghislaine tried to surrender. Ghislaine looked back with a cool, unwavering gaze, realizing that was exactly the outcome Kane was going after. As the crowd settled, the announcer looked over the betting sheets and hesitated, noting that he did not think a proper bet could proceed at this rate. The hooded assassin standing nearby looked on in confusion, wondering why the merchant was pausing. The merchant explained that absolutely nobody was betting their money on Duke Ghislaine. To the spectators, the result was way too obvious, and they jeered that the punk had no chance against young Master Kane, laughing that someone should bring in an idiot dumb enough to bet on the other side. Kane smirked at Ghislaine, mocking him because even the marketplace was ignoring him. The merchant suggested they change the contents of the bet to focus on how long Ghislaine could endure against young Master Kane. Suddenly, a massive, heavy sack of gold slammed onto the table with a resonant thud. Commander Scovin and Ricardo stood firm, declaring that they would bet everything on Duke Ghislaine. Ghislaine watched them with a faint, satisfied smile. Before the crowd could recover from their shock, another bag hit the table as Lady Elena stepped forward alongside Belinda. She stated that she would like to bet on her big brother too, which left the bystanders and the soldiers alike frozen in surprise. Elena looked at the merchant and asked if this would suffice, ignoring Belinda's reminder that she had advised against this. The fat merchant gleefully accepted the massive sum, exclaiming that it was more than enough. The hooded messenger watched the exchange with a dark, calculating expression. Kane huffed with impatience, complaining that they were making him wait for no reason. Ghislaine told him to get ready, but Kane smugly reminded him that he was the older cousin and it would look strange for him to make the first move. Ghislaine simply drew his sword, the metal singing as it left the scabbard, and told Kane to come at him. Kane's face twisted with rage as he asked if Ghislaine really thought it was not too late to act like the older one. He roared that Ghislaine had already stooped too low to save face and launched himself forward as the duel officially started. Kane leapt high and brought his blade down with a bone-shattering force, but Ghislaine parried the strike. Kane pressed his advantage, unleashing a series of heavy, fast attacks that sent sparks flying and tore up the ground. The crowd cheered wildly, convinced that Ghislaine would not even endure one hit from Kane. Elena and the others watched with mounting dread, but the hooded man remained silent. He knew that no matter the opponent, the moment they decided to cross swords against Kane, they were already trapped. He realized the opponent, overwhelmed by such immense power, would become consumed by the thought that there was no chance to counterattack and would use up all their energy solely on evasion. In his experience, the exhausted opponent would eventually leave an opening and meet their end, which was how Kane had always won. Ghislaine danced through the debris, dodging every lethal swing with millimetric precision. Kane laughed, noting that Ghislaine was as slippery as ever and that his skills had indeed grown, but he mocked him for being good at running away just as he had been in the old days. With a powerful grunt, Kane delivered a massive upward swing that caught Ghislaine off guard and sent him spiraling into the air. Ricardo and the others screamed for the young master as the hooded assassin smiled, smiled, declaring that it was over. Cain leapt into the sky to deliver the finishing blow, screaming at Ghislaine to die. However, Ghislaine remained perfectly composed even as he tumbled through the air. He condensed mana into his legs, stabilizing his descent and landing firmly on his feet. The assassin's smile vanished as he realized Ghislaine had returned to a stable state so easily. Ghislaine exhaled a sharp breath and mocked Cain's ignorant swordsmanship. He pointed out that Cain must have thought he was the strongest just because his opponents would get scared if he showed even a little bit of his strength. He told Cain that he would now allow him to open his eyes. Cain snarled, asking how he intended to do that, and charged blindly. Ghislaine moved with blinding speed, performing a sequence of high-level parries and counters that left Cain reeling. He delivered a brutal, arcing strike that carved through Cain's defense, leaving the massive warrior bloodied and gasping for air. The crowd fell into a stunned, breathless silence as they saw Duke Ghislaine dominating the fight. Elena beamed with joy, while Scoven and the others looked on in awe at the level of skill being displayed. The hooded messenger narrowed his eyes, noticing that although the wound on Cain was deep enough to draw blood, it was actually shallow. He wondered if Ghislaine had done that on purpose and how he could possibly show such a mastery of swordsmanship. Ghislaine looked down at the kneeling Cain and told him that such a gap in skill would not provide enough entertainment for the tourists. He tossed both of his swords aside, the metal clanging against the stone, and announced that he would be fighting barehanded from now on. Cain was filled with a murderous rage, but Ghislaine remained unmoved. He rolled up his sleeves, clenching a powerful fist and declaring that he thought he should use this opportunity to educate Cain with his bare knuckles. "Educate me?" Cain repeated the words with a face contorted in pure disbelief. Ghislaine stood his ground, calmly stating that since Cain was clearly no match for him in swordsmanship, he would take a handicap. He proposed they have a bare-handed fight, a discipline he noted Cain allegedly excelled in. To further raise the stakes, Ghislaine declared he would bet 2,000 gold, twice the initial amount, on his own victory. The surrounding crowd erupted in confused murmurs, shocked by the astronomical sum of money and the audacity of a bare-handed duel. The hooded assassin narrowed his eyes, marveling at the boy's apparent insanity but gleefully whispering to himself that fortune was still on their side. "All right, place your additional bets," the fat merchant announcer yelled, his voice booming through the arena as he declared the event was now a bare-handed fight between the two heirs. While many in the crowd remained skeptical, calling a challenge of sheer force outright stupid, several others began to shift their bets toward young Lord Ghislaine. Cain let out a low, rough laugh and told Ghislaine that he made him laugh. He mockingly told his cousin to go ahead and fight without a weapon, but as he gripped his own massive hilt, he roared that he would still use the sword. Belinda screamed from the sidelines, calling Cain an asshole and desperate, telling the young lord to pick up his sword too. Cain ignored her, screaming for Ghislaine to die as he launched himself forward with a massive swing. Ghislaine remained perfectly composed, thinking to himself that just as he thought, he needed to knock some sense into the brute. As the blade descended, Ghislaine moved like a phantom, slipping beneath the strike and entering Cain's guard. Without the weight of a blade, his movements were explosive and fluid. He buried his bare knuckles into Cain's solar plexus and followed up with a rapid-fire barrage of strikes to the chest and jaw. A final, heavy blow slammed into Cain's head, sending the larger man crashing to the stone floor. Cain lay there gasping for air, his vision swimming as he wondered how a punk like Ghislaine could possibly display such movements. Ghislaine loomed over him as a dark silhouette against the sky. The spectators went wild, shouting that the fight was spicy and realizing that young Lord Ghislaine might actually win the duel. Ghislaine looked down at the struggling warrior and told him to get up, coldly remarking that he had not even gotten started yet. Infuriated, Cain scrambled back to his feet and lunged again, swinging his sword with desperate, wild force. He screamed that Ghislaine used to be unable to even look him in the eye and would always bow down on his own whenever he showed up. Cain declared that he had to kill Ghislaine to secure the Loges family's future, but Ghislaine met the emotional outburst with a relentless physical assault. A brutal series of punches rained down on Cain, each one delivered with a calculated precision that shattered his defense. Ghislaine became a whirlwind of violence, pummeling his cousin until Cain finally lay defeated, gasping out a final question of why this was happening. Ghislaine reached down and grabbed a handful of Cain's hair, forcing him to look up. He expressed a sudden, genuine pity for Cain's father, recalling how Count Loges had supported the Perdium family until it was on the verge of demise simply because he was friends with Ghislaine's father. Ghislaine noted that it was clear the son had a very different idea in his mind. A memory from a few years ago at Loges County flickered through their minds, showing the Count facing heavy criticism for sending support to Perdium again. His advisors had called it pouring water into a cracked bucket, yet the Count had stood his ground even when a young Cain begged him not to go. The Count had quietly stated that he helped because they were friends and there was no other reason. Returning to the present, Ghislaine delivered a final blow that he felt ought to have educated his cousin enough. He reached out a hand and told Cain to get up. To the absolute shock of the entire arena, Cain knelt on the ground and publicly admitted his defeat. The announcer's voice cracked with shock as he declared that young Lord Ghislaine had won. While the crowd screamed about their lost or won bets, Elena and Belinda celebrated with jumps of pure joy. The hooded assassin lost all his calculated composure, rushing forward and grabbing Cain by the collar. He demanded to know how Cain could admit defeat so early just because he was at a little bit of a disadvantage, screaming that he had trusted him. Cain told him to let go, stating firmly that he was done. The assassin ground his teeth, cursing the weak little brat. Ghislaine approached the hooded man with a tranquil, knowing smile, noting that he had to do what was necessary. Raising his voice so the entire city could hear, Ghislaine called for everyone's attention and announced that the hooded man was volunteering to pay for all the meat and drinks for everyone gathered there. The assassin's jaw dropped in horror, but the crowd exploded into cheers, praising Ghislaine as the best young lord. The assassin lunged for Ghislaine, screaming that he never agreed to this and demanding he withdraw the statement. Ghislaine easily caught the man's shoulder and squeezed with bone-crushing strength. He told him that this was simply the price for losing the duel and that a man of his caliber should have at least that much gold. He reminded the villain to add the 2,000 gold from the secondary bet onto the original 1,000. Ghislaine's eyes flared with a terrifying dark power as he leaned into the man's ear, warning him that if he tried to run, he already knew what would happen. The assassin saw the image of a screaming skull reflected in Ghislaine's eye and choked out a desperate confirmation that he understood. As the stadium roared with newfound respect, Ghislaine walked away. The next day in his room, Ghislaine stared at a massive chest overflowing with gold coins, realizing he could hire a small mercenary corps, but knowing that growing wealth took more time than he had. He knew he needed to prepare faster for the business he had in mind. Suddenly, Elena and Belinda entered, and Elena asked what he planned to do with all that money. He asked if she wanted some, but she claimed she was just asking. Belinda smirks, suggesting it was obvious because Lady Amelia's birthday was coming up, and he clearly wanted to buy an expensive gift for his fiancée. Ghislaine froze in total shock, realizing with a start that he actually had a fiancée. Belinda and Elena exchange a knowing look, with Belinda laughing that he didn't have to be shy. She teased him, saying they knew he was playing dumb because he was embarrassed that people could read his mind. Elena added with a huff that they were specifically talking about Amelia from Rayfold County. At the mention of that name, Ghislaine's eyes narrowed as a cold memory flooded his mind. He remembered that woman vividly. To the public, Amelia Rayfold was a noble among nobles, revered for her kind nature and actions toward everyone regardless of status, which had gained her the deep support of her people. However, Ghislaine knew the dark reality that she would later incite rebellion and earn the title of the Witch of the North. Most importantly, he remembered that she was a traitor who had joined hands with the Delphine Duchy to drive the final nail into Perdium's downfall. A sharp, dangerous smile played on Ghislaine's lips as he turned back to his conversation. He asked Belinda when his father was expected to return to the estate. Belinda looked up from her work, noting that the Lord should be back in maybe a week. Ghislaine calculated silently that a week should be more than enough time. He stood up and announced that he would be visiting Rayfold County immediately. Belinda was caught off guard, pointing out that it wasn't even Amelia's birthday yet and asking why he was in such a hurry. Ghislaine's expression was cold and determined as he explained that his goal was to get money from them. In a flashback to Rayfold County, Amelia was shown kneeling in the dirt before a ragged, barefoot child. She handed over her own ornate shoes and softly commanded the girl to wear them. As the crowd of commoners looked on in emotional disbelief, Amelia stood up, stating that if anyone had to walk barefoot on her land, it should be her. She then ordered her soldiers to provide food and shelter for the refugees right away, earning heartfelt thanks from the people. Later, the scene shifted to her private garden where she sat regally in a gazebo. Her escort knight, Burnif, knelt at her feet, carefully tending to them. He told her she had done a great job that day and noted that she had successfully won the people's hearts. He pointed out that this would definitely prove favorable in her future successor competition. Emilia remained silent for a moment before suddenly slamming her foot into Burnif's face. He took the blow without a word as she asked what had happened in the recent duel against the man known as the finest sword of the North. Burnif offered his apologies, explaining that he had lost on purpose to avoid needless attention, knowing that if he had stood victorious, people might have started paying attention to her as well. He insisted that it was not yet the time for her to reveal her claws because his blade belonged entirely to her. Emilia grabbed his chin, pulling his face close and reminding him that she had invested a great deal to raise him. She told him firmly that he was not allowed to be weak. She then asked how things were progressing with the merchants. Burnif assured her that she needn't worry about the Arxium Merchant Guild. He explained that all the materials used for the reconstruction of the forest outposts in Perdium were being purchased through their own guild, essentially allowing them to recoup all the support funds Count Rayfold sent to the Perdiums each year. Furthermore, they were actively recruiting all the high-quality soldiers and knights who were abandoning the failing Perdium estate. Emilia approved, reminding him to maintain the appearance of an ordinary merchant guild until they had fully built up their strength. Their secret meeting was interrupted by a local butler who arrived in a sweat, announcing that young Lord Ghislaine Perdium had come to visit. Emilia's eyes flashed with annoyance as she asked why that punk would come there. The butler explained that Ghislaine claimed he had something to discuss regarding the merchant guild. In the visitor's room, Ghislaine sat casually on a sofa with his sword resting beside him. He greeted Emilia calmly, but her white cat hissed at him with bared fangs. Emilia remarked that the visit was quite unpleasant since he came without notification, asking if he had not yet learned etiquette or manners. Ghislaine ignored the insult, noting that her birthday was coming soon and he thought he'd give her a gift in advance. He dropped a branch of flowers onto the table, mentioning the fragrance was nice and that he had picked it up from the merchant guild out front. He deliberately named the Arxium Merchant Guild as he took a sip of tea. Emilia froze, her red eyes wide with shock. She stood up abruptly, claiming that now that she had received the gift, she would be off. Ghislaine's voice cut through the air with a weight of authority as he called her full name and commanded her to sit down. Emilia felt a stifling feeling pressure emanating from him, wondering what this power was. She couldn't believe it was coming from the same guy who used to squirm and barely speak whenever he stood before her. Ghislaine told her to get straight to the point, stating that he needed money and demanding 10,000 gold. Emilia gasped, asking if she should take such a large and sudden request as the will of Count Perdium. Ghislaine laughed, telling her that his father had nothing to do with this and that she should just give it to him. He leaned in, pointing out that she wasn't planning to marry him anyway. As the tension peaked, Ghislaine mentioned that if word got out about her secretly building up power in Rayfold during a fierce succession fight, things would get complicated. Emilia's cat shrieked as she warned him not to say such things even as a joke. Ghislaine smiled coldly, promising to keep it a secret as long as he didn't leave the room empty-handed. Realizing it was a threat, Emilia called out for Burnif. The doors burst open and the escort knight stepped in, greeting Ghislaine with a dark look. Ghislaine recognized Burnif as a skilled individual with the potential to be compared to the finest swordsman of the north. He asked Emilia if she was sure she could handle the war that would break out if he died in her home. Emilia countered by saying the world would simply hear that a ruffian had barged in, caused chaos, and was killed by a guard. With a lethal glint in her eyes, she ordered Burnif to kill that man. Burnif drew his rapier, ready to obey, but Ghislaine remained unfazed. He gripped his own sword and thought to himself that if that was how she wanted to play, he would have no choice but to get a little serious. Burnif lunged forward, his rapier a silver streak in the dim light of the visitor's room. Ghislaine remained seated for a fraction of a second before a hidden assassin suddenly dropped from the ceiling, blade poised to strike. Ghislaine moved with the instincts of a seasoned veteran, throwing himself back as the assassin's dagger shattered the very air where his heart had been. He vaulted over the sofa, his movements sharp and calculated, while the assassin's strike carved through the expensive upholstery. Staring at the masked attacker, Ghislaine noted that he was dealing with an actual assassin, mocking the Rayfold household for feigning politeness while launching a surprise attack. He remarked on their poor hospitality, asking if Rayfold had no knowledge of chivalry. Burnif adjusted his stance, his expression cold as he replied that Ghislaine was the one who was rude first by arriving unannounced and unsettling the lady. He added that there was no need to be polite to such a person in the first place. The two men clashed in a whirlwind of steel, their blades meeting with high-pitched rings that echoed through the hall. Ghislaine parried a flurry of thrusts, noting that the narrow, precise strikes targeting his head were designed to mess with his sense of timing. He realized that at close range, it was hard to overpower a man of Burnif's skill with technique alone. Emilia watched from her seat, her eyes wide with mounting fury as she saw her finest guard being matched by a man she considered a lousy punk. She shouted for Burnif to hurry and bring her Ghislaine's head if he truly considered himself her sword. Burnif bowed his head slightly, promising his lady that he would not disappoint her. He channeled a dark, surging mana into his body and commanded Ghislaine to come forth. Ghislaine scoffed at the order, asking how a mere escort knight dared to order him around. He noted that he had done them a favor by holding back, but if they insisted on a fight to the death, he would do as they wished. Burnif attacked again, his speed nearly doubling as he pushed his body to its absolute limits. Ghislaine danced through the strikes, his blue eyes glowing with a calm, lethal light. He acknowledged that Burnif was fast and was clearly enduring the physical strain by condensing mana into his legs. As the fight intensified, Ghislaine realized he couldn't afford to waste any more time. He flicked his hand, sending out a nearly invisible mana thread that snared the air around Burnif. The knight was momentarily confused, wondering when Ghislaine had made such a thing. In that split second of hesitation, Ghislaine stepped into Burnif's guard and delivered a devastating punch directly to the knight's face. Blood sprayed from Burnif's nose as he was sent reeling back, his rapier clattering against his own armor. Emilia screamed the knight's name in shock, unable to comprehend how her champion had been struck so cleanly. Ghislaine stood firm, his sword resting casually on his shoulder as he watched the knight struggle to regain his footing. Burnif realized that Ghislaine's swordsmanship didn't look like something learned systematically. It was the style of someone who had picked it up through the brutal reality of actual combat, much like the barbarians of the north. He admitted that the saying about never truly knowing someone until you fought them was true. Turning to his mistress, Burnif told her she needed to get out of the room because he could no longer guarantee her safety at this rate. He pointed his blade at Ghislaine, his face covered in blood, and declared that from now on, he would give it his all. Ghislaine's smile widened into something genuinely dangerous, noting that this was exactly what he liked to see. He whispered that he hadn't met such an entertaining opponent in a very long time. Emilia sprinted through the opulent corridors, her mind racing with fury and confusion. She wondered how Ghislaine dared to cause her such humiliation, searching her thoughts for the idiot who could have leaked detailed information about her secret merchant guild to that madman. The rumors of him slaying orcs, protecting his younger sister from assassins, and even defeating the heir of Loges had seemed like exaggerated luck, but now she questioned the terrifying reality of his growth. Cursing under her breath, she wondered what on earth the guards she had stationed in advance were doing. As she reached a darkened hall, she found the answer in the form of her soldiers lying unconscious on the floor. A hooded figure stood over them, noting with a smug smile that it had been a while. Emilia gasped as she recognized the intruder as the Perdium family maid. Before Emilia could call for help, the maid moved with blinding speed, pinning her against the wall and pressing a sharp blade to her throat. She commanded the lady to be quiet and stay still. Looking closely, the maid remarked that Emilia still kept an unpleasant clockwork spider on her lips. She recalled eavesdropping on a conversation years ago where Emilia's siblings had bullied her with creepy insects, leading the girl to raise spiders of her own to take her revenge. The maid speculated whether this was a way to overcome trauma or a display of self-assertion, but she noted that the habit simply did not suit a lady. With a swift movement, she snatched the mechanical spider and crushed it under her heel, then coldly asked for Amelia's cooperation. Back in the visitor's room, the air grew heavy and rough with the pressure of an overwhelming amount of mana. Burnif adjusted his stance, asking if Ghislaine really found him to be an entertaining opponent, noting that such words sounded more like the talk of a lowly mercenary than a noble. Ghislaine stood his ground, retorting that he was indeed a noble and suggesting that an escort knight should know his place instead of trying to order him around. They clashed again, their blades meeting with a deafening ring that sent sparks flying into the air. Burnif roared for Ghislaine to not disgrace the nobility as he unleashed a fierce, multi-directional barrage of thrusts. Ghislaine realized the man was pushing forward with a terrifying level of intensity, forcing him to use every ounce of his skill just to survive the onslaught. Burnif saw what he thought was the final opening and lunged forward with a lethal strike, declaring that Ghislaine's previous attack was his last. The rapier pierced deep into Ghislaine's shoulder, drawing a spray of crimson blood. To Burnif's shock, Ghislaine did not recoil. Instead, he braced himself for the injury and used his own body to push the blade away, creating a gap in the knight's defense. Burnif realized he could not let his guard down for even a second, noting the vast difference between a man who fought for entertainment and one who wielded his blade for survival. Ghislaine smiled despite the blood soaking his shirt, admitting that the fight was truly entertaining. He acknowledged that Burnif controlled the flow with overwhelming speed and range, but he whispered that he had no choice but to bring the man down right there. He told the knight that he had overlooked one vital factor, a unique mana cultivation technique. Ghislaine unleashed his third core, his mana erupting into a violent, glowing aura that filled the entire room. He lunged forward with a power and speed that Burnif could not comprehend, their blades clashing in a final, explosive exchange. Burnif wondered in terror how a human could possibly wield such immense mana during combat. In an instant, the duel was decided. Ghislaine stood victorious, his sword held firmly at Burnif's throat. Nearby, Amelia was held captive by the hooded maid, who kept a dagger pressed against her neck. Amelia ground her teeth in a fit of rage and desperation, finally commanding Ghislaine to take his 10,000 gold and get out of her sight. Ghislaine wiped the blood from his face, complaining about what a hassle the situation had become. He noted that it would have been much better if she had handed over the money when he asked nicely. The maid remarked that the scene was quite intense for a lover's quarrel, and Ghislaine dryly replied that they simply had a difference in opinion. He then looked Amelia in the eye and delivered the final blow, announcing that the fee for his trouble had just increased to 20,000 gold. Silence fell over the ravaged hall where broken furniture and downed guards told the tale of a violent confrontation. Burnif bowed his head low, offering a sincere apology to his lady and admitting that he had failed to correctly assess the young master's strength beforehand. He noted that in a single instant, Ghislaine had emitted an aura that surpassed even that of an advanced level knight. Amelia Rayfold stood amidst the wreckage of her room, her face twisted with a mixture of anger and calculation as she realized that Ghislaine Perdium had truly changed. Burnif asked if she wished to report this incident to the Delphine Duchy, but his suggestion was met with immediate violence. Amelia lunged forward and seized Burnif by the collar, slamming him against the wall and commanding him to watch his mouth. She snarled that he clearly did not understand how terrifying Duke Delphine could be, warning that if the Duke found out about their humiliation, they would both be finished. She explained that her secret alliance with the Delphine Duchy had been forged behind her father's back through a covert agreement where the Duke would support her rebellion in exchange for her help in destroying the Perdium family. Amelia realized that if the secret were exposed, her own siblings would not hesitate to kill her. If Ghislaine already knew the secret of her merchant guild, she feared he might also be aware of this treasonous pact. Gritting her teeth, she declared that they had to do whatever it took to kill Ghislaine. Burnif acknowledged the command, reporting that he had managed to leave multiple light injuries and one heavy wound on the boy's shoulder. He noted that because Ghislaine had expended an explosive amount of mana, he would likely be vulnerable for some time. However, they could not use the knights of their own land without leaving a trail of evidence. Amelia's eyes flashed with a cold, predatory light as she revealed that they had been training specialists for exactly this kind of situation. She described a group consisting of war orphans and statusless outcasts who were natural-born experts in clandestine operations, the wildcat traffickers. She ordered Burnif to assemble a dozen of their most mana-proficient members. Marking a specific point on a map, she chose the ravine that served as the only narrow path between Rayfold and Perdium. It was a remote location with tight terrain, making it the ideal place to quietly handle their problem. Burnif promised to get them prepared immediately. Staring into the distance, Amelia vowed that Ghislaine would pay for the humiliation he had brought upon her. Far from the city, a carriage rattled along the road as Ghislaine checked the bandages across his muscular chest. He wondered if Amelia was already making her move. Fergus watched him with concern, asking if the young master was truly alright, but Ghislaine brushed it off, noting that the cuts were not that deep despite him taking things a bit overboard. He thought to himself that the 20,000 gold he had extracted from Amelia was enough to cover the base funds needed to rebuild his territory, effectively saving him years of effort. While he would have preferred to kill Amelia then and there, he knew war would have been unavoidable, and he could not risk the safety of his people on a momentary whim. He decided that simply knowing the secret of the Archium Merchant Guild was enough of a burden to place on her for now, intending to make good use of her in the future. Inside the carriage, Belinda sat across from him, noting that things were proceeding exactly as he had planned. She reminded him that he had told her to subdue the guards once she heard the sounds of fighting and to take Amelia hostage the moment she fled the room. Ghislaine looked at her with a blank expression, admitting he had said those things but reminding her that he had actually given those specific orders to Fergus. Suddenly, a wave of intense pain washed over him. His face went pale as he clutched his chest, coughing up a spray of crimson blood. He realized this was the brutal recoil for opening his third core too early. While it was better than his experience in his past life, it was a troublesome consequence he could not afford to face every time he used his power, concluding that he needed to find a way to increase his mana capacity quickly. Belinda reached out and snatched his hand, her touch firm as she noted that his mana flow was a total mess. She produced a sharp needle and began to channel her own energy into him. Ghislaine watched in shock as a cool, stabilizing sensation surged through his veins, realizing his entangled mana road was being forced open. He knew such a method could only be executed by someone with a deep, masterful understanding of mana. He stared at his head maid, realizing she was far more than an ordinary servant. He remembered that his mother had been the one to bring her to the estate, yet he could not understand why such a skilled individual was working as a maid in the countryside. Still, he welcomed the help, knowing it was vital to have as many experts as possible on his land since the enemies he had faced so far were just the beginning. Belinda shifted the conversation, telling him she would help him with anything because she trusted him unconditionally. However, she asked for the real reason he had taken such a massive amount of money from his fiancée. Ghislaine replied simply that he had to spend money and Amelia was the only rich person he knew. The answer left both Fergus and Belinda staring in disbelief. Fergus stammered out a question, asking if that was truly why he had broken the engagement and warning that Count Rayfold would be furious. Ghislaine assured them it was fine, noting that Amelia would never dare tell her father about the incident. He looked at Belinda and asked if she trusted him, to which she smiled nervously and suggested he should at least tell the person who took the risks what he planned to do with the gold. Ghislaine's expression turned grave as he looked out the window and spoke of the forest of beasts. He declared with absolute certainty that he intended to pioneer the dangerous woods. Fergus leapt from his seat in protest, insisting that such development had been attempted and failed repeatedly since his great-grandfather's time. Ghislaine silenced him by asking if he remembered the request he had made before they entered the castle. Fergus hesitated before confirming that the person Ghislaine had asked for was indeed at the specified location, though he expressed doubt about the man's condition and survivability. Ghislaine didn't care about the details, stating that as long as the man was alive, it was enough. The carriage came to a halt in a secluded, snow-brushed clearing before a weathered wooden lodge. Ghislaine stepped out and knocked firmly on the door. Belinda looked at the dilapidated house, sensing it was abandoned, but Ricardo confirmed the address was correct. The door creaked open to reveal a massive, grizzled man with a wild white beard and a thick pelt draped over his shoulders. Belinda whispered her doubts to the young master, unsure if this broken man could survive another day, let alone fight a war. Ghislaine ignored her, staring into the scarred face of the hermit. The old man growled, asking the young noble if he was bored and telling him to get lost before he wasted any more of his time. As the man turned away, Ghislaine spoke a name that stopped him in his tracks. Gillian, the ex-captain of the Regressed Mercenaries. The old warrior's lone eye flared with a ghostly blue mana as he turned back. Ghislaine reached out a hand toward the legend, his voice filled with a calm, unwavering respect as he told the man that he had longed to see him. Fergus and Ricardo stood frozen at the mention of the Regressed Mercenaries, a legendary group known for admitting only those who had mastered almost every type of weapon. Though the group no longer existed, their bravery was famous enough that any knight, even from foreign lands, was bound to have heard their name at least once. Ghislaine reached out his hand toward the grizzled veteran, stating that he had specifically come to meet the captain of that group, Gillian. Without warning, a massive axe arced through the air, narrowly missing Ghislaine and shattering the landscape around him. Fergus and the others trembled in shock as Gillian's oppressive aura filled the clearing. Gillian noted that the boy seemed to know him and demanded he state his business. Belinda stepped forward, drawing her own dagger and warning the young master to stand back, as she believed the man was not in his right mind. Looking directly at the hermit, Ghislaine spoke of the eternal punishment. Gillian flinched as Ghislaine claimed he knew the cure for the incurable illness Gillian's daughter was suffering from. He asked the old warrior if that piqued his interest. The narrative of the disease played out in Ghislaine's mind, describing the high fever, the coughing of blood, and the red spots that bloomed like flower petals across the skin. Because the patients would writhe in agony like prisoners under torture, the world had named the disease the eternal punishment. Inside the lodge, Gillian had been reduced to a desperate father, screaming the name Rachel as he held his child. Ghislaine observed that it was not too late. He remembered his past life when he had tried to find Gillian only to discover the man had died after his daughter passed away, having spent every asset he owned on failed treatments. The young girl, Rachel, whimpered in agony, begging her father to let her die because it hurt so much. Ghislaine prepared to act, but Belinda grabbed his arm, urging him to leave. She argued that this was not a problem strength could solve, pointing out that even priests called it a punishment from the gods and asking what he planned to do about it. Ghislaine looked her in the eye and simply stated that he could fix the girl. When Belinda hesitated, he asked if she trusted him, which silenced her. He handed her a list of ingredients and told her to purchase every medicinal herb listed and return immediately. In his previous life, he had learned that knowledge was survival for wandering mercenaries, and though the eternal punishment was currently considered incurable, a simple albeit expensive cure would eventually be discovered. Ghislaine began the process by finely chopping a rare flower called the Fairy's Blessing along with several other herbs. He packed them into a glass bottle and poured distilled alcohol over them, shaking the mixture thoroughly. After letting it sit and adding the final ingredients, he handed the glowing purple vial to Gillian and told him to have his daughter drink it. Gillian carefully administered the medicine. Within moments, the red spots began to fade from the girl's skin. Gillian gasped, unable to believe the medicine actually worked. Ghislaine noted that it worked well, explaining to the stunned father that divine power only enhanced vitality rather than providing a fundamental cure. Gillian fell to his knees and gripped Ghislaine's arm, asking with a trembling voice if his daughter could truly be cured. Ghislaine guaranteed that within a couple of months, she would be perfectly healthy. Overcome with gratitude, Gillian asked what Ghislaine wanted in return. He assumed the young noble had come seeking something and offered himself as a dog or a slave if that was the price. Ghislaine pulled away, stating he did not need a slave, he needed Gillian, the captain of the Regressed Mercenaries. Gillian saw a unique spark in the boy's eyes, realizing they were the eyes of a dreamer. Suddenly, the high tension was broken by the arrival of a hidden threat. A cloaked assassin lurked nearby, but Gillian sensed him instantly. The old warrior erupted with a sudden, blue mana, moving with a speed that left Ricardo and Fergus reeling. Gillian unleashed a devastating attack using a weighted chain, pulverizing the incoming attacker and smashing him against the wall of the lodge. He grabbed the survivor by the throat and demanded to know who had sent him. The assassin gaped in terror as Gillian asked Ghislaine what he would like to do with the prisoner. Ghislaine admitted he could already tell who had sent him and reached for his own blade to finish it, but Gillian stopped him, asking to be allowed to handle the matter himself. With a single, effortless movement, Gillian crushed the life out of the assassin. Belinda watched with a pale face, worried about why her master would recruit such a dangerous man who showed no hesitation in killing. Gillian turned back and knelt before Ghislaine, addressing him by his full name. He declared that from that moment on, he would leave his life in the young master's hands. Ghislaine smiled inwardly, realizing he had just secured a crucial card for his upcoming reconstruction plan. He looked at Gillian with a steady gaze and told him that he looked forward to working together. Deep in the darkness of a marshy hideout, the news of a slaughtered reconnaissance unit spread like a cold chill among the cloaked figures. Their leader, a formidable man named Viega of the Wildcat Traffickers, commanded his men to be quiet and lower their voices, his patience clearly wearing thin. One subordinate offered a desperate apology, explaining that according to the intelligence they had received, Ghislaine shouldn't have even been able to find their scouts, let alone kill them. He stammered out the terrifying truth. The legendary Gillian had officially joined the young master's group. Enraged, Viega seized the messenger by the throat, his red eye glowing with a murderous light as he demanded to know if the man was certain of what he saw. The subordinate choked out a confirmation, swearing he had seen the former captain with his own eyes. Viega stared into the night with a predatory grin, realizing his old captain was finally making a move. Meanwhile, the sound of galloping hooves echoed through the forest as two carriages raced forward. Inside the cramped lead carriage, Belinda shifted uncomfortably, complaining that it was suffocating and wondering why Gillian had to bring so much gear, questioning if he was an arms dealer instead of a mercenary. She noted they had been forced to buy an additional carriage just to fit everything. Ghislaine remained calm, pointing out that they needed the extra space to ensure Gillian's daughter, Rachel, could travel comfortably. He watched the massive warrior through the window, stating that Gillian likely had a specific use for every weapon he brought. Behind them, Fergus and Ricardo maintained their positions as the rearguard. Belinda turned her attention back to their recent captive, certain that the watcher had been sent by Amelia Rayfold. Ghislaine agreed, noting it was almost guaranteed. Belinda warned that they were in for trouble, identifying the assassin's mask as a symbol of the Wildcat Traffickers, a powerful and ruthless guild based in Rayfold. She described them as filthy scum who handled smugglings, drugs, and human trafficking, noting that many members were former mercenaries, making them a shadowy and dangerous force. When Ghislaine asked how she knew so much detail for a woman who spent all her time in a castle, Belinda hesitated before claiming she had simply heard many stories before she began working for his family. She urged him to be persistent and careful, but Ghislaine looked ahead with total confidence. He assured her that everything would be fine because they now had Gillian on their side. As the carriages entered a narrow, steep ravine, the ground suddenly exploded upward in a coordinated strike. Gillian's eyes narrowed as he realized they were caught in a ground ambush. Without a moment of hesitation, he leapt from the driver's seat, his massive axe carving through the air. He slammed the heavy blade into the rising attackers, blood spraying across the dirt as he slaughtered the assassins with brutal efficiency. Viega watched the massacre from a ledge, realized that his men were being crushed and that the situation was a trap. Below, Ghislaine leaned out of the carriage window, watching the ambush unfold exactly as he had expected. More assassins lunged from the shadows, their blades gleaming, but they were no match for Gillian's overwhelming strength. Viega stepped forward, calling out Gillian's name and labeling him a coward who had disbanded an entire elite mercenary group just for the sake of his daughter. Gillian stood among the corpses of his enemies, stoically stating that he didn't know what the man was talking about. Viega grew more bitter, shouting that he had ended up living a life he never wanted because of Gillian and asked if the old old man had become too senile to remember his former peer. He laughed mockingly, deciding he would force Gillian to remember him before ordering his remaining men to kill everyone. Ghislaine asked if Gillian needed any help, but the old warrior told him to rest, insisting he should be fine on his own. Gillian swung his axe in a wide, lethal arc, bisecting 2 attackers in a single motion. Viega noted that Gillian was as strong as ever but ordered his units to spread out into 2 groups to flank the warrior from both sides. Gillian responded by mounting one of the carriage horses, mounting a charge that shocked the traffickers. He used the horse's momentum to deliver bone-crushing strikes, sending men flying like ragdolls. Viega yelled for his fools to aim for the horse, realized they couldn't get near the man himself. Gillian used his weighted chain to pull an airborne assassin down into a lethal impact, then used his shield to block a desperate strike from Viega himself. Viega snarled that since Gillian had ruined his life, he should at least not hinder his current work. He vowed to kill his former captain at any cost. Gillian blocked a massive downward swing and looked Viega in the eye, his gaze filled with a cold, absolute certainty. He declared that he was no longer the captain of the Regressed Mercenaries. He explained that he had discarded his past entirely and was now nothing more than a loyal subordinate to young Lord Ghislaine. Viega roared in a blind, jealous rage, charging forward with a scream of pure hatred, promising to kill Gillian at all costs. The forest night was pierced by the sound of clashing steel as the wildcat traffickers pressed their ambush against the carriages. Viega snarled at his former captain, shouting that the mercenary company had been disbanded the moment Gillian walked away. He accused the white-haired warrior of leaving him without a purpose, forced to live a disgraceful life just to make a living. Gillian remained silent, his expression unreadable behind his thick beard as he parried a relentless flurry of strikes. Viega's rage only intensified as he claimed he had been prepared to sacrifice his entire life to make the Regressed Mercenaries the greatest in history. He looked at Gillian with eyes filled with a murderous glare, unable to forgive him for throwing everything away just to end up as a mere pawn for a spoiled noble. The battle moved in a blur of blue mana and shadows. Gillian deflected several thrown daggers with his shield, but Viega mocked his strength, asserting that its former glory was years in the past. He spat that while Gillian was wasting time trying to cure his dying daughter, he had been putting himself through countless battles to grow stronger. Viega declared that Gillian was no longer a match for him and lunged through the air for what he believed would be the finishing blow. Screaming that it was finally over, he drove his blade downward. In a shocking display of control, Gillian caught the lethal edge with his bare hand, which glowed with a brilliant sphere of mana. He stared into Viega's stunned eyes and calmly asked if his daughter was truly the only reason for this vengeance. Viega gasped, realizing Gillian had condensed his mana around his hand and wondering if the old man had been hiding his full power the entire time. With a massive surge of force, Gillian sent Viega flying through the air and crashing brutally against the trunk of a tree. Gillian walked forward with measured steps, noting that he did not understand why Viega hadn't come to kill him sooner when there had been plenty of opportunities. Coughing up blood, Viega admitted that he had already visited Gillian's old home, but found only a feeble old man who was not even worth killing. He roared with frustration, demanding to know where the Gillian he used to look up to had disappeared. Gillian closed his eyes for a moment before telling Viega to raise his weapon once more. He explained that while he was now a man bound to the will of another, he would show his former comrade the highest level of respect for this very moment. He declared he would fight as the captain of the Regressed Mercenaries. Viega's face twisted into a manic grin, excited that they were finally speaking the same language. The two veterans collided with the force of a storm, their movements too fast for the average eye to follow. Daggers and axes hummed through the air, carving deep marks into the earth as they traded blows. Eventually, Gillian's superior technique found its mark, and he delivered a final, lethal strike with his axe. He watched the light fade from the trader's eyes, stating that he would remember the 5th unit commander of the Regressed Mercenaries, Viega Villanos. As the blood stained the ground and the traffickers were finally silenced, Ghislaine walked up and offered his praise for a job well done. Belinda looked at the scattered bodies and suggested that selling the attack as loot could bring in a significant amount of money. Gillian bowed his head, apologizing for causing more delays than necessary, but Ghislaine assured him it was fine. Watching the grizzled warrior, Ghislaine realized Gillian was far more exceptional than he had even expected. He remembered the stories he had heard as a young mercenary in his previous life, realizing those legends had laid the foundation for him to eventually become the mercenary king. He felt that moving quickly to recruit him was the right choice. Ghislaine asked if Gillian truly remembered who the man was, and Gillian quietly confirmed that he had been an old comrade. Ghislaine stared up at the moon, thinking about his own old comrades from his past life and wondering what they were doing now. He knew they were living their own lives since this was before they had ever met him, but he vowed to scout them out someday. He then told everyone to follow Belinda's suggestion and collect anything valuable from the dead. Gillian jokingly remarked to Belinda that he was not her subordinate when she tried to order him to lead the collection effort. 2 days later, the carriage reached the hills of the Perdium territory. Ghislaine breathed a sigh of relief, noting that they were finally here. Gillian looked out at the sprawling castle in the distance and asked if that was Perdium, and Ghislaine confirmed it, feeling a deep sense of relief to have a home home to return to. He remembered how he had felt when he first ran away, thinking he would be able to come back at any time, but the reality he now saw was different. He asked Gillian how he liked the land, and though Gillian tried to be polite by calling it great, Ghislaine pointedly asked if it wasn't shitty. He described the outdated houses and the uncultivated fields, explaining that the farmers had all been conscripted into the military, leaving the land forcibly fallow. Gillian admitted that while he heard Perdium was always at war because of the northern barbarians, seeing the situation firsthand proved it was worse than he expected. Belinda watched her master, noting that he had never known his own land this well before. Ghislaine declared that he would resolve all these problems, which was why he needed Gillian's strength. He knew it would be a long battle to eliminate everything connected to Duke Delphine and revive the land, but he vowed to do it no matter what. Suddenly, Belinda pointed toward the castle gates, calling for the young master to look. Ghislaine stared at the distant castle with narrowed eyes, recognizing a stern silhouette that could only belong to one man. He whispered the word father as he watched the current ruler of the land, Zwalder Perdium, standing atop the fortifications. The count looked on with a cold, piercing gaze, his heavy blue armor draped in thick fur that caught the mountain wind. Inside the meeting hall of Perdium Castle, a tense discussion was already underway. Zwalder sat at the head of a long table, stating flatly that they would need to reduce their military forces. Homern, the general administrator, was taken aback and asked for clarification, while Albert the treasurer leaned forward with a worried expression. Albert argued that if they cut back any further, it would be impossible to maintain the front lines properly. Knight Captain Randolph interjected, suggesting they request more support from Rayfold, but Albert sighed, explaining that the Rayfolds were the ones who had already reduced the support fund. He added that intelligence suggested they were gathering soldiers and stockpiling food for themselves. Randolph gasped, realization dawning on him that their allies were preparing for something else. Zwalder insisted that the cuts were unavoidable because they needed to prioritize rebuilding the Forest of Beasts garrison, which had been partially destroyed during the recent orc raid. He noted that even reducing the Night Order's size would barely afford them any breathing room. Randolph questioned the gamble, asking if such a drastic reduction didn't pose a significant risk to the entire territory. Watching from a seat in the back, Ghislaine listened to the familiar arguments, thinking that it was the same old cycle he remembered. He reflected on the strange nature of time, noting that while he had only been the young lord of Perdium again for a few months, he had lived as the mercenary king for several decades. He stood up and greeted his father, welcoming him back. Zwalder offered a stern grunt in response, never breaking his disciplined posture. As a child, Ghislaine had never liked his father for being so strict and serious all the time, but now he could finally see the truth. He recognized the countless burdens of exhaustion and fatigue weighing on the count's shoulders, the heavy mantle of responsibility that came with being the lord of a struggling land. Zwalder took a slow sip of tea and noted that he heard Ghislaine had been away from the castle for about a week. Ghislaine told him that he had visited the Rayfolds. Zwalder looked him in the eye, expressing a hope that he hadn't caused any trouble this time, and Ghislaine lied calmly, stating that he had not. Albert checked his ledgers and admitted that although it was hard to believe, rumors said the young lord had won a duel against Cain and secured a large amount of money. He looked at Ghislaine with skepticism, asking if he had gone there to gamble. Ghislaine rolled his eyes inwardly, thinking that it was an investment rather than gambling, though he told Albert he simply had some business with Amelia. Homern tried to lecture him, repeating his usual advice that Ghislaine needed to think before he acted since he was the successor to the house. Ghislaine brushed him off, telling the old man not to worry. Homern ground his teeth, frustrated that the brat was ignoring his earnest advice. Zwalder slammed his hand onto the table to bring order, stating that was enough. He looked at his son, noting that from what he heard, Ghislaine had made some good trouble while he was away. He asked if it was true that Ghislaine had executed Jamal and Philip after they tried to sell Elena. Ghislaine remained silent, but Captain Randolph barked that there was no way the boy had done it himself. He insisted that the traitors likely fought each other and the story had been exaggerated to make it look like the young lord delivered the final blow. Ghislaine decided to let Randolph believe what he wanted to avoid further trouble, noting that the captain probably didn't like the fact that his own knights died at the hands of a supposed weakling. Zwalder stared at his son for a long moment and told him he did a great job. He stated that no matter how it was done, the only thing that mattered was that Elena was alive. Ghislaine felt a pang of emotion, realized this was the very first compliment he had ever received from his father. Emboldened, he asked if he could make a single request. Homern immediately interrupted, warning that if he was going to ask for money as a reward, he would be cut off right there. Randolph agreed, reminding everyone of the trouble Ghislaine had caused in the past, including selling military supplies for gambling money, setting the front gate on fire to grill an army horse, and melting down armor to try and forge a legendary sword. Ghislaine's sweat dropped, thinking to himself that his past self sure had done a lot of nonsense. He clarified that he didn't want money, he wanted permission to pioneer the Forest of Beasts. The room fell into a shocked silence. The Count's reaction was immediate and negative. Back in his private room, Ghislaine told Gillian and Belinda that his father had freaked out and said no. Belinda agreed with the Count, pointing out the forest was filled with monsters and there was nothing to gain from it. Gillian added that it was known as the Forest of Death, from which no one returned alive, making it a place of notoriety that everyone avoided. Ghislaine smiled, noting they knew the legends well, but he stood up and told them it was time to get started anyway. Belinda screamed for him to stop, asking why he would proceed without permission. Ghislaine explained that he didn't actually need permission and had only asked out of courtesy because the task was essential. When Belinda asked what he was so obsessed with, he told her he would explain later. Privately, he knew that if word spread about what he was looking for, it would cause a catastrophe. He knew that near the forest entrance lay a massive, hidden vein of runestones. These mana-infused ores were extremely rare minerals used for magical tools, barriers, alchemy, and research, and mages were absolutely crazy for them. In his past life, Duke Delphine had become wealthy off this discovery, but now the secret belonged only to Ghislaine. He looked at his companions and saw that Belinda was resigned to his plan while Gillian vowed to follow his orders. Ghislaine ordered Belinda to head to a nearby guild and hire around 200 mercenaries. Belinda was shocked by the scale of the spending, while Gillian warned that such a large number of rough and unruly men would be hard to control and might even turn on their employer. Ghislaine agreed but stated that they would personally pick out the most skilled individuals from the small-scale groups in the north. Gillian's face went pale as he realized Ghislaine was talking about those crazy dogs, the Cerberus mercenaries. He knew they were skilled enough but were famous for betraying their employers if things went wrong. Ghislaine merely smirked and told them it was time to go put a leash on those dogs. They arrived at the outskirts of the Zambar territory, approaching the chaotic camp of the Cerberus group. From a distance, a mercenary scout watched through a telescope, alerting his friends that a noble brat and his guards were walking into their trap and laughing about how much money they could make. Suddenly, Gillian exploded into the camp, seizing a scout by the face and slamming him into the ground with bone-shattering force. The mercenary screamed in agony, asking what the bastard was doing, but Gillian didn't stop, using his massive power to clear out the entire vanguard. The remaining mercenaries looked on in horror, demanding to know who the hell had attacked them, and ordered everyone to prepare for battle. A high-ranking mercenary with long gray hair stepped forward, telling Gillian that while he looked like a noble, he couldn't act so recklessly and told him not to expect to return home alive. A tall, imposing shadowed figure armed with heavy spiked maces stepped out from the main tent. Ghislaine sat atop his white horse, looking down at the gathered killers with a cold, bored expression. He commanded them to shut it and told them to bring him their captain immediately. Riding a white horse with a calm, stoic gaze, Ghislaine entered the chaotic mercenary camp and asked who held the rank of captain among them. The ragged warriors stared him down with cold eyes until a long-haired mercenary chuckled, remarking that it seemed a noble brat had finally lost his mind. He spun a massive, spiked mace on a heavy chain, declaring it was time for the boy to learn what it truly meant to take responsibility. The iron ball whistled through the air, but Gillian moved like a shadow, catching the metal links with his blade and redirecting the force into the earth. The mercenaries gaped in pure disbelief, wondering how anyone could shove a sword into a moving chain with such precision. Ghislaine realized that words alone would never get through to these men. He turned to Gillian and gave him a single, lethal order, telling him to do just enough for the attackers to not die. Gillian acknowledged the command and erupted into a whirlwind of violence. He tore through the camp, his massive axe and shield pulverizing everything in his path. The desperate mercenaries screamed that they wouldn't go easy on him just because he was a noble, but they were no match for the former captain's skill. Ghislaine dismounted his horse and ignored the groaning bodies on the ground, telling the surviving small fry to scram and bring him their captain immediately. From the depths of a nearby tent, a weary voice asked about the cause of the commotion, complaining about interrupted sleep. A man with vibrant red hair and a muscular, bare chest stepped out, identifying himself as Kaur, the captain of the Cerberus mercenaries. He looked at the wreckage of his camp and asked why Ghislaine was looking for him. Ghislaine replied that there was no other reason for someone to seek out a mercenary group than to entrust them with a request. Kaur was unimpressed, asking what kind of client treated subordinates in such a manner and suggesting that as a noble, Ghislaine should be more knowledgeable when it comes to basic manners. Ghislaine looked him in the eye and explained that this was his own way of greeting, noting that it was the best way to tame the group properly. Kaur smirked at the idea of being tamed, laughing that he couldn't imagine what would happen if the young lord were to greet them twice. They moved to a large table to talk, where Ghislaine announced his plan to pioneer the forest of beasts and his desire to hire the group for the task. The room was filled with the shocked murmurs of the mercenaries, who asked if he was really talking about the monster-infested forest located near the Perdium territory. Kaur asked what kind of person would be brave or foolish enough to stir up such a dangerous place, and Ghislaine formally introduced himself as the young lord of the house. The atmosphere shifted into derisive laughter as the mercenaries realized they were talking to the boy from the rumors. They mocked him, convinced he was out of his mind and asking if he intended to pioneer the forest himself. Kaur's expression grew serious as he told the noble that having grown up in a greenhouse meant he didn't know what the forest of beasts was really like. He declared that it was no place for a rookie and announced that the negotiation was officially over. The mercenaries drew their weapons, ready to force the intruders out, but Ghislaine remained perfectly composed in his seat. He looked at Kaur and asked if the captain was simply scared. Kaur paused as Ghislaine noted that although he had heard the Cerberus group were quite skilled, it appeared it was all just a hoax. Kaur leaned back with his feet on the table, warning the young lord not to mess around. He argued that as mercenaries, there was absolutely no reason to do something that wouldn't pay off. Ghislaine smiled sharply, stating that it was always the weaklings who came up with the best excuses. Kaur's patience reached its limit. He remarked that the mood was ruined and called Ghislaine a clueless brat who wasn't even worth killing. He offered to let the boy go if he handed over some money for his trouble and simply got lost. Ghislaine closed his eyes and replied that such a thing would not happen. He looked at Kaur with a lethal gaze and requested to have a Moriana's recognition against him. Gillian stared in absolute shock as Kaur asked his cousin if he even knew what that was. Ghislaine explained that he knew it well, describing it as a traditional betting method passed down among mercenaries where two people fight using only a single dagger without relying on mana. He detailed the brutal rules, including having one of their arms tied together and losing if anyone stepped outside a small circle. He noted that it was a life or death struggle where often the victor and the loser both ended up dead. Most importantly, he explained that the loser must cleanly admit defeat and become the winner's dog. Gillian wondered how a noble could possibly know such a filthy tradition, realizing that as a captain, Kaur could never refuse such a challenge without admitting to weakness. Kaur laughed and stood up, telling his men they had a bold little noble who wanted to be recognized in the mercenary way. He signaled for his boys to help their guest a bit. Their wrists were bound tightly by thick rope as a massive circle of mercenaries formed around them, cheering for Kaur to kill the insolent noble. Kaur warned Ghislaine that there was no backing away now, boasting that he had already survived this ritual 5 times. Ghislaine pulled him close and whispered that while Kaur had done it 5 times, he himself had done it over 100 times. Kaur's eyes widened in sudden terror as he saw a glimpse of the true monster standing before him. Suddenly, the duel began with a vicious exchange of steel. Kaur charged, his blade a blur, but Ghislaine parried with practiced ease. The captain mocked him, telling the noble brat to make his bluff seem real if he intended to lie, but he privately noted that the youth was holding on far longer than expected. Around the small circle, the Cerberus killers jeered, certain their leader would crush the interloper for messing with them. Gillian watched with a grave expression, realizing it was a losing battle by design. He knew the area of the circle was barely large enough for a single person to lie down, and with the rules forbidding mana and force, the participants were forced to purely rely on physical strength. He observed that the size difference and limited movement meant the young lord could barely dodge or block his opponent's attacks, while Kaur had every opportunity to take control and dominate the fight. If the situation became truly dire, Gillian prepared to grasp the heavy axe on his back. Kaur pressed his advantage, his powerful strikes leaving Ghislaine pale and struggling. He laughed, asking if the young lord was hitting his limit already. He told Ghislaine that he could see right through him, explaining that while his strategy was likely to deflect or dodge blade strikes with his weapon while enduring less damaging blows by absorbing them with his body, the lack of mana in Moriana's recognition meant every impact inevitably stacked up. He noted the strain building up in Ghislaine's legs and mocked the struggle showing on his face. In the depths of his mind, Ghislaine felt a familiar thrill, thinking that the near impossible odds were exactly what made the fight fun. He shifted his posture, no longer fighting against the captain's overwhelming momentum. Instead, he relaxed his muscles, redirecting the force of the attacks to create his own lethal flow. A sudden, heavy kick from Ghislaine caught Kaur in the midsection, sending a surge of pain through the mercenary's body. Kaur gasped, unable to believe the punk could move like that after taking such a beating. Gillian realized the young lord was overcoming the disadvantage of size through pure technique. Desperate to end it, Kaur snarled that his resolve was impressive but reminded him that many opponents would break the rules and use mana when cornered. He warned Ghislaine that he wouldn't last long in this line of work if he broke the rules there. Ghislaine simply replied that he liked that sentiment. Kaur admitted that in a head-to-head match he might be at a slight disadvantage, but he declared that the conditions for victory weren't limited to just overpowering him. He reminded Ghislaine of another rule of the Moriana holds: if even one foot steps outside the circle, it is an automatic loss. He roared that no matter how skilled he was, if he sent Ghislaine's entire body flying, he would have to touch the ground outside. With a triumphant cry, Kaur lunged, certain he had won. But as Ghislaine was hurled toward the boundary, he used the tension of the rope binding their wrists to his advantage. He performed a mid-air pivot, pulling the surprised captain toward him. In a flash of movement, Ghislaine slammed Kaur into the earth, pinning him to the ground while remaining firmly within the circle. Gasps erupted from the mercenaries as they realized their captain was out and the fight was over. Ghislaine looked down at the bloodied man and calmly declared that he had won. Kaur lay in the dirt, gasping out a demand to know who the hell Ghislaine really was to possess such a high caliber of skill. Ghislaine's blue eyes glowed with a cold authority as he told Kaur that he didn't like his attitude, reminding the man that he was currently talking to his master. Kaur tried to argue that the fight was over, but Ghislaine noted that since his opponent hadn't actually gone outside the circle yet, he would now begin disciplining his new subordinate. He raised a clenched fist, his expression hard and unyielding as he prepared to deliver a final lesson. With a series of powerful, focused strikes, he pummeled Kaor's face, sending sprays of blood across the parched earth. Kaor let out a ragged cry of pain, begging for him to stop and reminding him that the rules of Moriana's recognition demanded that the fight end when someone stepped out of the circle. Ghislaine's eyes remained icy and detached as he delivered another heavy blow, mockingly asking if the captain intended to fight according to rules on an actual battlefield as well. Kaor spat blood and called Ghislaine a total lunatic, wondering how a noble could act with such savage lack of restraint. The surrounding mercenaries watched in stunned silence, some wondering if it was right to let the young lord continue while others noted that the bet was already decided. Ghislaine ignored the murmurs, reminding Kaor that he hadn't actually physically left the circle yet. In a final act of desperation, the captain screamed for his men to kill the boy. The mercenaries hesitated, then began to step forward, but Gillian intervened instantly. He slammed his enormous axe into the ground with a deafening impact, a dark and oppressive blue mana radiating from his body. He declared with absolute stone-cold authority that anyone who tried to hinder the young lord's disciplinary measure would be killed on the spot. The mercenaries froze, paralyzed by the overwhelming aura of a legendary master. Panting and broken, Kaor looked up with a bruised eye, thinking to himself that every noble he had ever met before was nothing more than a loser. He remembered the overconfident pigs, the traitors, and the narcissists he had preyed upon, recalling how simple scare tactics had worked wonders to drain their pockets. He had earned his title of Mad Dog because of his ruthlessness, yet he could not fathom how he was now losing to a noble brat like this. The mercenaries watched their broken captain with mounting dread, fearing he would die if the beating continued. Ghislaine looked at the man's battered face and wondered if that was finally enough. He turned his gaze toward the silent circle of warriors and commanded them to bring him water, a bandage, and a towel. When they hesitated in confusion, he pointedly mentioned that their captain would die at this rate if they didn't act. The survivors snapped to attention and scurried to follow the orders of their new master. Gillian watched the scene with a grim sense of pride, realizing that in a world where fists were the only law that mattered, the young lord had engraved the truth into their heads using the most surefire method possible. He had shown them exactly who the boss was. A short time later, Ghislaine sat at the table in the main tent, pointing at a contract and demanding a signature. Kaor sat across from him, his face swollen and heavily bandaged, and offered a resigned grunt before signing the parchment. When Ghislaine looked at him with an expectant, blue-eyed stare, Kaor quickly corrected his tone, stammering that he looked forward to working with the young master from now on. Ghislaine smiled, noting that they were now family, and reached out to shake the captain's hand. He stated that he also looked forward to their mutual cooperation. A few days later, a massive gathering of 200 mercenaries assembled at the outskirts of the Perdium territory. The men were restless in the early morning air, yawning and complaining that they needed lunch to even begin working. Rumors spread among the ranks that their employer was a spoiled young lord, and many of the warriors laughed derisively, questioning if a brat could ever hope to manage seasoned mercenaries. A giant of a man with massive, bulging muscles named Gordon the Muscle clapped his hands together to get their attention. He argued that to handle a brat of an employer, they needed a representative to look out for their interests. He proposed himself for the role, intending to unite their voices to achieve the results they desired. Privately, he shared his plan to pressure the boy for extra compensation to line their own pockets without actually working hard, an idea his peers found highly reliable and entertaining. Gordon mocked the idea of serving a weak noble, boasting that his build was perfect for such intimidation tactics. As a lone figure on a white horse appeared in the distance, Gordon gathered his men to set up a scary environment and teach the noble how tough the world truly was. However, as the group drew closer, Gordon's smug grin vanished. He saw that behind the young lord rode Gillian and the entire Cerberus mercenary group, identified by their distinctive dog snout-shaped helmets. The mercenaries gasped in terror, wondering if those crazy dogs were actually following the child and what on earth he could have done to tame them. Ghislaine reined in his horse before the trembling giant and asked if he was the representative. Gordon stammered a nervous confirmation, identifying himself as Gordon the Muscle. Ghislaine looked him over and remarked that it was a cool name, casually patting the massive man on the shoulder. He formally introduced himself as Ghislaine Perdium and commanded Gordon to gather the men and prepare for the journey ahead. He looked toward the dark tree line on the horizon and announced with absolute certainty that they would now begin pioneering the forest of beasts. As the morning sun filtered through the canopy, the final preparations for pioneering the forest were completed. Ghislaine Perdium stood steady as Belinda helped him secure the heavy plates of his dark armor, the narration noting that construction of the expedition's temporary base, resource procurement, and the gathering of troops were all finalized. Looking out over the assembled crowd, Ghislaine saw a sea of armed men, with the massive Gillian and the fiery-haired Kaor standing at the front of the ranks. Turning his blue eyes toward his silver-haired attendant, Ghislaine asked Belinda to perform the head count one more time. She nodded in compliance, reporting that with the 148 mercenaries contracted through the office and the 41 Cerberus mercenaries brought by the young master, the total came to 192 after including their own inner circle. Ghislaine found the numbers sufficient and questioned if she had properly informed Scoven. Belinda assured him that while she expected opposition, Scoven was actually stepping in to ensure they would not be detected while entering the forest of beasts, as his position as the commander of the post meant they had nothing to worry about. High atop a wooden watchtower, Scoven and his subordinate gave a silent thumbs up of approval. Finding the situation reassuring, Ghislaine stepped forward forward and commanded everyone to line up. Facing the assembled warriors, he gestured toward the dark tree line, announcing that ahead of them lay the forest of beasts, the land they would soon pioneer. Raising his voice to carry over the wind, he reminded them of the rumors they had likely heard, describing it as a place filled with unknown dangers where various monsters, unseen threats, and things beyond imagination lurked within. Despite the risks, Ghislaine declared his absolute determination to conquer the place. His words sparked an immediate wave of panic among the rank and file, with men whispering in terror about the forest of beasts and the high probability that they would not make it out alive. Belinda snapped at the crowd, asking how they dared to interrupt while the young master was speaking, but Ghislaine remained unbothered. He calmly stated that those who wished to withdraw could do so now, but then offered a heavy incentive, promising that if the mission succeeded, he would pay everyone 3 times their current rate. The prospect of gold immediately changed the atmosphere as the men shouted in excitement, finding the mission suddenly very appealing. Belinda leaned in close, whispering in a frantic tone about the nonsense he was spouting since they had already spent all their funds on preparations. Ghislaine simply smirked, explaining that this was how one boosted morale, privately knowing that he would be able to pay them and still have a fortune left over once they secured the glowing blue runestones. He looked back at Belinda and asked if she trusted him, to which she sighed, admitting she had no choice but to do so. In the back of the line, Gillian and Kaur watched their young master with respect, noting that while offering such pay was crazy, it was a testament to his boldness and the fact that he was a man who always had a plan. With the speech concluded, Ghislaine declared it was time to move, and the Forest of Beasts expedition team marched into the shadows. Deep within the woods, the silence was shattered by the rhythmic fall of axes against ancient wood. The mercenaries moved in a coordinated effort, felling massive trees and clearing the thick overgrowth. Ghislaine watched as a patch of light finally broke through the dense canopy, noting that they finally had some illumination. He pointed forward, commanding the men to keep clearing the path in that specific direction. He barked out further orders, telling them to cut down the trees, chop them into logs, and load them onto the carts, while those without specific tasks were to dig around the stumps to make uprooting easier. As he worked, Ghislaine reflected on the Forest of Beasts development journal from Delphine that he had obtained in his previous life, recognizing the vastness of the territory. He knew that while they would eventually drive out all the monsters and utilize the forest resources, his immediate need was money, and he had to secure the fastest route to the hidden runestone vein. He pulled out a map, tracing the curved red line that led toward the mineral deposit. Ghislaine himself took up an axe and began swinging with precision, an action that caught the eye of Kaur, who wondered if the employer was really stepping up to do physical labor. Nearby, a few arrogant mercenaries whispered amongst themselves, questioning if the noble was trying to show his dignity by leading by example, or if it was all for show. They mocked him, betting that he would give up soon enough. Belinda's sharp voice cut through their gossip, ordering them to stop chattering and get to work quickly. The men mockingly complied, though Belinda remained frustrated by their attitude. She approached Ghislaine and asked why he was personally working, warning him that the men were taking him lightly because he was doing the same labor as them. Ghislaine didn't stop his swing as he replied that it was fine, noting that the more hands they had, the quicker the job would be finished, and there was nothing good about staying in this place for long. Belinda observed him with a complicated expression, remarking that he spoke as if he already knew everything in advance. Ghislaine remained silent, focused on the task. Elsewhere in the clearing, Kaur and Gillian carried massive logs with ease, with Kaur grumbling about how jealous he was that their employer had a woman worrying about him. He lamented that he had not only become a dog to the boy but was also walking into hell with his own feet. As the work continued, Ghislaine felt that everything had been going too smoothly. He recalled how the Duchy of Delphine, which had eventually established a new dynasty, began large-scale development here. In his past, he couldn't figure out why they chose this specific place, but the journal he possessed now recorded the locations of major resources and the local ecosystem. He had come prepared, yet he looked at the hundreds of lanterns they had brought, an expense that made some mercenaries wonder why they didn't just use cheap torches. Ghislaine felt a creeping unease at the absence of any incidents, as he had only read about the dangers in the journal and had never seen them firsthand. He warned the men not to let their guard down as the forest grew deeper. Darkness seemed to swallow the area as the men noticed the sky turning black prematurely. One mercenary commented on how dark it had gotten, while another laughed off the danger, suggesting the forest's reputation was just a false rumor since they hadn't seen a single monster. A bald mercenary named Gordon carried a log over his shoulder, listening as his companions joked about feeling sorry for getting triple pay for such easy work. Suddenly, Gordon stopped in his tracks, looking confused. He asked his companions if they were certain they had chopped down all the trees on their way in, and they confirmed they had. Gordon pointed ahead with a trembling finger, asking why the path was suddenly blocked by a gargantuan, gnarled tree that hadn't been there before. The color drained from the faces of the nearby men as they realized the geography had shifted. Ghislaine's voice rang out with chilling authority, calling for everyone's attention. He drew his blade, a signal that Gillian and Kaur immediately followed by readying their own weapons. The mercenaries panicked, wondering what was happening and why the atmosphere had suddenly turned so heavy. Ghislaine looked directly at Gordon, who was still standing near the mysterious tree, and told him bluntly that he would die if he stayed there. He ordered the man to come toward him slowly, taking it one step at a time. Gordon, sweating profusely, began to back away with his log, but his nerves failed him. He tripped and fell backward with a desperate cry, losing his grip on the timber. His companions watched in horror as the massive tree behind him began to shift, its bark rippling like muscle. The mercenaries were paralyzed by the wrongness of the scene. One of them began began to mock the situation, laughing that the employer was just scared and that there was nothing there, claiming Gordon was just mistaken because the scenery looked similar. Ghislaine turned his cold gaze toward the mocking man, telling him to come over as well or he would die. The man scoffed, asking if Ghislaine thought they didn't know he was just trying to intimidate them. Before he could finish his sentence, a dark, vine-like appendage whipped out and wrapped around his waist. The man let out a confused sound before he was violently jerked into the air. He screamed in terror as he was hauled toward the canopy. Ghislaine noted that these creatures had no presence at all and their movements were impossible to predict. From the trunk of the tree, a massive, jagged mouth filled with white teeth opened wide, and the screaming mercenary fell directly into the abyss of its maw. A giant, glowing red eye snapped open in the center of the dark timber, staring down at the remaining humans. Ghislaine stood his ground, his hand tight on his sword as he identified the ancient predator of the woods, calling it a dirus ent. The forest floor transformed into a nightmare as the towering dirus ents fully revealed themselves, their red eyes glowing with predatory hunger. Panic erupted instantly among the ranks, with men screaming in terror at the sight of the monsters and shouting for everyone to run before they were eaten alive. One of the massive creatures lashed out with a thick, rope-like vine, snatching a man from the ground and pulling him toward its gaping, tooth-filled maw. Gordon groaned in agony as he was hoisted into the air, desperately calling for help. A nearby mercenary swung his axe with all his might to save him, but the blade simply bounced off the wood, leaving the man shocked by how sturdy the vine actually was. Just as Gordon was about to be swallowed, Ghislaine lunged through the air, his blade glowing with a sharp blue radiance. With a single, fluid strike, he severed the vine and sent the monster reeling. Seeing the men paralyzed by fear, Ghislaine commanded them to get themselves together, warning that they would only be easier targets if they remained spread out. He ordered them to raise their shields and form a tight formation to ensure no one else was caught by the vines, telling them to focus entirely on defense until his next order. The men responded with a desperate compliance, blocking all directions as they swore they wouldn't die in such a place. Turning toward the red-haired captain, Ghislaine asked Kaur if the oil lamps were ready. Kaur confirmed they were all there, finally realizing why the young master had brought so many of them. Ghislaine gave the command to burn them down, telling the men to light the lamps and hurl them at the monsters. The mercenaries threw the first volley, but the dirus ents were quick, swatting the lanterns out of the air with their branches before they could break against the trunks. Kaur and the others realized with a grimace that they couldn't burn them down if the lanterns never hit their mark. Sensing the shift in the battle, Gillian stepped forward with a massive axe, the weapon glowing with mana as he cleaved through the air, while Belinda moved like a silver blur, her daggers striking the ents with lethal precision. Ghislaine quickly adjusted the plan, telling Gillian and Belinda to protect the Cerberus mercenaries while they prepared to throw more lamps. Declaring that he would draw the monster's attention himself, Ghislaine charged forward. Belinda's voice was filled with worry as she told the young master to watch out, but he was already dancing through a storm of lashing vines. He moved with the grace of a master, his sword cutting through the wood like paper as he dodged every strike. The regular soldiers watched in awe and fear, certain their employer was about to be stomped on as all the monsters turned their focus toward him. Belinda saw the opening she needed and screamed for the men to throw all their lamps now, certain it would work this time. A wall of fire descended upon the distracted ents, the oil-slicked flames finally taking hold of their thick bark. Kaur and his men kept throwing without pause, determined to burn them to ash. The mercenaries cheered as the monsters were engulfed in an inferno, believing that the monsters were nothing more than simple trees that were weak to fire. However, Ghislaine remained grim, telling them not to let their guard down because the battle was not yet over. A sudden, massive eruption of white steam filled the clearing, rising like a pillar and extinguishing the flames. The men whispered in confusion, wondering if the fire had been put out or if it was just steam. Gillian and Belinda rushed to Ghislaine's side as he explained the nature of the beast, stating that while the shells were weak against fire, the moist flesh inside was reacting to the heat and causing the steam. From the charred husks of the trees, grotesque, purple-fleshed monstrosities emerged, their flower-like heads opening to reveal circular maws of endless teeth. The soldiers trembled at the sight of the creature's true appearances, but Ghislaine raised his sword high into the air. He called for everyone's attention, commanding them to raise their weapons. He declared that from now on, they were in a close-quarter battle, and with his eyes glowing with lethal mana, he gave the final command to charge as he dove headlong into the fray. The mercenaries stared in shock at the gargantuan purple monstrosities, whispering in terror about the impossibility of fighting such things up close, fearing they would be crushed by a single movement. However, the hesitation was shattered as Kaur and his Cerberus mercenaries lunged forward with wild grins, eager for the slaughter. Belinda watched with concern, calling out for the young master to be careful as he dove into the thick of the fray. Gillian stood as a pillar of strength behind the wavering ranks, asking the men what they were hesitating for. He reminded them that this was Grand Duke Ghislaine's order, telling them to simply trust and follow. Spurred by the legendary warrior's words, even the most fearful mercenaries decided to follow orders, figuring that if things went south, their employer would take care of it. Ghislaine carved through the soft, exposed flesh of the dirus ents, shouting for his men not to be afraid. He pointed out that since the protective shells had been burned off, the monsters were now nothing more than oversized scarecrows that could be cut down even without mana. Kaur roared in agreement, urging everyone to crush them in one go. Gillian and Belinda moved like a coordinated storm, their strikes leaving trails of blood and severed wood in their wake. Ghislaine reflected that hesitation on the battlefield meant death, and he saw it as his personal role to erase that doubt in those who followed him. With a powerful, mana-infused swing, he cleaved through the core of the massive beast, determined to instill the will to make the impossible possible. When the dust finally settled, the mercenaries stood amidst the remains of the creatures, gasping in disbelief that they had actually taken down such monsters. Ghislaine commanded everyone to form up, noting that they were still only at the entrance of the forest of beasts, which was already crawling with such threats. He looked back at his weary troops and told them not to worry, promising that he would always take the lead. He asked them to trust him and follow, receiving a unified and spirited response of "Yes, sir." As the expedition continued its journey, they faced a relentless barrage of threats. They fended off massive ice-blue golems and navigated through the thickest brush. In the heat of the struggle, Kaor's blade flashed red as he cut through high-level beasts, while Belinda tended to a small cut on Ghislaine's face, her eyes sharp with focus. Suddenly, a massive boar-like creature with glowing red eyes and enormous tusks charged from the shadows. The soldiers panicked as the beast roared, wondering why the monsters kept coming non-stop. Kaor and Gillian intercepted the charge, but the creature's massive weight caused it to collapse toward the panicked ranks. Ghislaine dropped from above like a hawk, his sword piercing the beast's skull and ending the threat instantly. Once the area was secure, Ghislaine asked if anyone was hurt. The men were relieved to be alive, and the veterans among them realized that if they wanted to live, they had to stay close to their employer's side. Gillian and Kaor shared a look of respect, noting that nothing beat real combat for shaping up a group of men. Ghislaine pointed forward, reminding them that there was still a long way to go and they needed to keep clearing the path. While the majority of the men were starting to believe in him, one man named Manus watched with wide, fearful eyes, thinking that everyone in this forest had gone completely mad. Eventually, the trees thinned to reveal a pristine, shimmering lake under the moonlight. The men rushed to the shore, marveling at how clean the water was as they drank their fill. Belinda stood beside Ghislaine, staring at the dark surface and wondering what might come out of the depths. Ghislaine noted that they had come the right way so far, as this lake was the most critical junction needed to reach the hidden runestone vein. He gave the order to set up camp with the lake at their backs, deciding they would rest there for the night. As the campfires crackled, the mercenaries sat in small groups. Some were exhausted, questioning what they were even doing there and fearing what else would emerge if they went further. Manus, the rat-faced mercenary, whispered to his companions, suggesting they should secretly turn back. He claimed there was no need to take more risks and argued that their lives were more important than the promised gold. He accused Ghislaine of being the rascal of Perdium and claimed he was recklessly seeking glory at their expense. An eye-patch-wearing veteran soldier cut him off, pointing out that the employer had already paid them in advance and had saved their lives multiple times. Manus scoffed, insisting it was just luck and that all nobles were the same, seeing mercenaries only as meat shields. He secretly planned to use the others as bait if things got dangerous. However, the veteran pointed toward the center of the camp. There, Ghislaine was personally treating a wounded soldier, applying a thick layer of green medicinal paste to the man's hand. He warned the soldier to be careful not to get water in the wound to avoid infection. When the soldier thanked him, Belinda noted that the medicine was incredibly precious and asked if he shouldn't save it for himself. Ghislaine simply replied that saving it for later would be pointless if it was needed now, and called for the next person in line. The veteran mercenary noted that the medicine alone cost more than their lives, proving that Ghislaine was not the kind of man to abandon his people. This display of genuine care left Manus fuming, realizing that Gillian was getting in the way of his plan to sow discord. Ghislaine soon stood up and told everyone to stop chatting and rest while they could. He then moved aside with Gillian and Kaor for a private talk. Kaor was visibly annoyed by the gossip, stating that if it were him, he would have ripped the loudmouth mercenary's tongue out. Ghislaine told him to leave the man be, as he couldn't do anything with the monsters around anyway. Turning to more serious matters, Ghislaine asked about the count of the lamps they had hung around the perimeter. Kaor reported there were 24, but Ghislaine's expression darkened. He noted that the number had decreased. He looked out into the oppressive darkness, reflecting that ever since they entered the forest, monsters had been attacking day and night, yet for the past 2 nights, there hadn't been a single attack during the dark hours. Gillian's face turned grim as he realized the implication. It meant they had entered the territory of monsters that were active at night, a territory of significant influence. Ghislaine stared into the silent, black woods, stating that from this point forward, it would be the most dangerous. Under the silent watch of the moon, the camp lay shrouded in a heavy, unnatural stillness. Gordon, the massive mercenary, lay resting until a sudden warmth flickered across his face. He blinked his eyes open, confused by a strange glow, and found a lantern hovering in the air directly before him. His confusion turned to pure terror as the lantern was jerked away into the void by an unseen force. Gordon scrambled backward in the dirt, asking what in the world was happening as the light vanished into the trees. From the pitch-black shadows, a cluster of predatory red eyes glared back at him, their gaze cold and malevolent. Gordon swung his mace wildly, screaming for the monsters to get away from him and stay back. His frantic shouts woke the entire camp, but when the other mercenaries arrived, they saw nothing but empty air. They questioned Gordon's sanity, asking what was going on and suggesting he might have had a nightmare because they had been dealing with so many monsters lately. Gordon insisted there was a monster beside him just a moment ago, but looking around at the empty clearing, he began to doubt his own eyes. A tall, silver-haired mercenary stepped forward, confirming that it was not just sleep talking. He explained that he had woken up because he felt a strange presence and then saw a lantern disappear right before his eyes. The camp erupted erupted into a chorus of fearful murmurs, with men reporting they had heard creepy laughter and felt as though they were being watched. Ghislaine walked into the center of the camp with Gillian and Kaur at his side, acknowledging that the mercenary had seen right through the deception. With a calm but firm tone, he ordered everyone to gather up. Inside the command tent, Ghislaine laid out the grim reality, explaining that the monsters had likely been following them since they reached the lake. He identified them as Falors, the hunters of darkness that dominated the nights of this forest. He described their ability to melt into the shadows, making them invisible to the naked eye and immune to standard physical attacks. He revealed their cruel hunting method, using hundreds of their kind to slowly steal every light source, luring their prey into total darkness where they excelled at killing. The news that hundreds were surrounding them sent a shiver through Gordon and the others. Kaur, ever the aggressor, suggested they strike first before the monsters could toy with them any further. However, Ghislaine disagreed, stating they would wait for the Falors to start their attack to find the best timing for a counterattack. Belinda pointed out that they had already lost more than half their lanterns and worried that waiting would only make them more vulnerable. Ghislaine countered that attacking recklessly would only stimulate the monsters' sadistic tendencies, and he intended to wipe them all out at once. Gillian questioned if such a feat was possible against hundreds of invisible foes, and Ghislaine confirmed it with a sharp nod. He asked Belinda if the magic scrolls were prepared, and she confirmed they had been distributed to each mercenary. Ghislaine used his sword to draw a tactical map in the dirt, explaining that the herd of Falors had surrounded them from 3 directions while stealing their lamps to tighten the position. He noted that while they were vastly outnumbered, setting up camp with the lake at their backs prevented them from being surrounded from all sides. He smiled confidently, stating that they actually held the initiative in this fight. He divided the forces into 3 distinct groups: the defenders who would take on the brunt of the attacks, the crossbow units who would halt the enemy's progress, and the elite assault unit consisting of himself, Gillian, Kaur, and Belinda. He explained that the defenders and crossbowmen would hold the middle while the assault unit flanked from the left. By surrounding the monsters in turn, they would secure victory. While the men doubted if such a plan was even possible, Gillian believed it could work if the center held. Belinda questioned how they would handle the physical immunity again, and Gillian suggested using mana, but Ghislaine revealed that the magic scrolls were their true trump card. As the final lantern flickered and died, the darkness became absolute, broken only by the crimson glint of hundreds of eyes. The shield wall braced as the men shouted for everyone to stay in formation and not split up. Something massive and unseen slammed into the line, and the men cried out in fear as the very last of their light was taken. Ghislaine stood ready, recalling the Delphine Pioneer Journal, which stated that Falors were extremely vulnerable to light. He held up a magic scroll, and as it glowed with a blinding blue mana, he gave the command to activate them now. All at once, the mercenaries triggered their first circle light magic scrolls, and a dome of brilliant radiance repelled the darkness. The soldiers gasped in horror and realization as the light revealed hundreds of grotesque, eel-like monsters with multiple red eyes and gaping maws that had been surrounding them the whole time. Ghislaine didn't give them a moment to hesitate. As the true appearance of the enemy was laid bare, he pointed his glowing sword forward and ordered the assault units to charge. Ghislaine, Kaur, Belinda, and Gillian lunged into the mass of monsters, their weapons ready to carve through the now vulnerable hunters of darkness. Ghislaine led his elite warriors directly into the heart of the shadow creatures. The young master gripped his massive, blue glowing blade, diving headlong into the mass of Falors. He noted that while these hunters possessed the uncanny ability to assimilate into the darkness, their actual physical defense was extremely weak. With his current team, he was confident they could pierce through the enemy ranks in no time, ordering his companions to cut their numbers down as much as possible. Gillian moved like an immovable mountain, drawing the creatures' attention and keeping their aggression focused entirely on him while his massive axe carved through the air. In the meantime, Kaur lunged into the fray with a wild grin, his dual blades disrupting the monster's formation with chaotic, high-speed strikes. Belinda remained light on her feet, providing lethal support by creating openings with her daggers and mana-infused movements. She called out to the young master, watching as he unleashed a devastating arc of blue light. Ghislaine reflected that this was the true elite power of Perdium, a force capable of turning the tide of any nightmare. Away from the elite group, the main line of defenders struggled under the relentless pressure. The mercenaries fended off the lashing, eel-like monsters, their shields clattering under the weight of the assault. The crossbow units shouted in desperation, realizing they had run out of arrows and were being overwhelmed by the sheer number of foes. Just as the line was about to break and the men screamed in terror, the assault unit smashed into the monster's flank. Ghislaine arrived at the front, telling the weary men they had done well. The mercenaries cheered, shouting that the employer had arrived and they were saved. Ghislaine didn't let up, commanding the troops to widen their formation and surround the Falors from all directions. He declared it was finally their turn to overrun the enemy. Sensing the change in momentum, the remaining Falors suddenly shrieked and began to retreat into the deep woods. The mercenaries watched in confusion as the monsters fled, but Ghislaine observed them with a cold gaze, noting that the creatures were quite quick-witted to retreat before they could be fully encircled. Belinda approached him, asking if they should give chase or if it was better to let them go since they were retreating. Ghislaine explained that Falors were obsessive predators that would return to harass them for days if left alive. He stated there was no reason to give them a second chance, as they had to avoid a war of attrition at all costs. He knew their entire social system would collapse once they lost their leader, so he ordered Belinda to find the one with a horn on its head. He identified the horned monster as was the one sending out the retreat signals. Belinda looked at Ghislaine, silently noting how much he had changed and matured into a true leader. She responded with a determined nod, letting her silver mana thread spin out from her fingers. She leapt into the air, her silver-white hair flowing behind her as she scanned the fleeing herd. Spotting the target, she declared she had found it and used her threads to snare the horned beast. Ghislaine didn't waste a second, lunging forward with a burst of speed that left a trail of mana in his wake. He caught up to the leader and brought his heavy blade down with lethal precision, declaring that it was over. The leader of the Falors was cleaved in two, its dark blood spraying across the forest floor. With the leader dead, the remaining monsters fell into a blind panic. Ghislaine shouted for his men to wipe them out and not to spare a single one. The mercenaries, now bolstered by confidence, charged forward to hunt down the retreating shadows. They mocked the creatures, asking if they had enough fun hiding in the dark and promising they would regret trying to hunt the expedition down. Kaur and Gillian continued their friendly rivalry in the heat of battle, with Kaur telling his Cerberus mercenaries to make sure they didn't lose to the old man. As the first light of dawn began to touch the horizon, Ghislaine brought his sword down on the very last monster. He looked over the battlefield and announced that they had won, declaring victory to the exhausted but triumphant troops. The men raised their weapons and cheered, embracing the fact that they had survived the night. Gillian and Belinda approached Ghislaine, asking if he was hurt anywhere and thanking him for his hard work. Ghislaine told them they all did well and asked Belinda to perform a final head count while Kaur brought over the Cerberus survivors. He then gave a strange order to Gillian and Kaur, telling them to spread the Falor corpses around the perimeter of the camp. Kaur was confused, asking if spreading dead bodies had some sort of special effect. Gillian explained that the smell of the corpses would chase away other monsters, as Falors were near the top of the food chain at the forest's entrance. He told the younger mercenary that it meant the camp area would become much safer. Kaur took offense to being called a kid, asking Gillian if he wanted to settle their differences right then and there. Ghislaine ignored their bickering, reflecting on the fact that it had been around 10 days since they entered the forest of beasts. With the Falors exterminated, he had eliminated all major sources of danger from his planned route. He looked at his map, seeing the final path to the runestone vein was now clear. He stared out at the rising sun, wondering if the hardest part was truly over. Belinda returned with the report, stating that all 41 members of the Cerberus mercenaries were accounted for, while there were 126 survivors from the contracted mercenaries, which was 3 less than before the battle. Kaur bragged that his men had no casualties because he was their captain, receiving a silent look from Ghislaine. Ghislaine noted the 3 missing men and asked where Manus went. Gordon, who was resting nearby, suggested the man probably died while fighting. However, the veteran mercenary with the eye patch disagreed, pointing out that no corpse was found. He stated that considering Manus's cowardly personality, he had clearly fled during the heat of the battle. Deep in another part of the forest, Manus and his 2 accomplices were running through the brush, gasping for breath. The 2 men thanked Manus, saying they would have died in the battle if it weren't for him. Manus urged them to keep moving, telling them they needed to get as far away as possible while the others were busy fighting. He claimed they needed to keep running if they wanted to live. Suddenly, his 2 companions stopped moving, staring into the darkness with hollow eyes. Manus snapped at them, asking why they stopped, but then he looked behind him. 2 massive, glowing orange eyes peered out from the shadows of the ancient trees, belonging to a creature far larger than anything they had faced. Manus stared up in absolute horror, his teeth chattering as he asked what the hell that thing was. In the quiet aftermath of the battle, logs were hoisted onto wagons as the mercenaries worked with a newfound fervor. Kaur observed them with a mix of surprise and respect, noting that they were working together perfectly without a single order being barked. He remarked that he had never seen those lazy mercenaries work this hard before, to which Gillian added with a smirk that they had truly changed, unlike a certain someone standing right next to him. Kaur brushed off the old man's teasing, turning his attention back to Ghislaine. He asked if the youth planned to let the mercenaries go once the expedition was finished, suggesting it would be a pity to only put them to use once. Ghislaine reassured him, stating that he intended to hire them all as his private mercenaries. He understood that while mercenaries usually lacked organizational skills, these men had surpassed their limits through the life or death experiences they gained in the forest. To Ghislaine, they would serve as an excellent foundation for expanding his future power. A mercenary named Gazelle reported that the Falor corpses had been scattered along the path as instructed. Kaur praised the work, noting that the effect of the corpses was as potent as Ghislaine had predicted. They hadn't seen a single monster since leaving the camp. Ghislaine, however, remained vigilant, hoping that his lingering unease was merely a needless worry. His thoughts were interrupted by Belinda's return. She dropped from the trees, reporting that she had seen something significant up ahead. Ghislaine's eyes sharpened as he commanded the men to pave the path with all their might, declaring that they were almost at their destination. As they broke through the final thicket, a massive, luminescent glow filled the air. The mercenaries stood in stunned silence before a gargantuan cavern teeming with massive, glowing blue crystals. Ghislaine confirmed their success, identifying the site as the reason for the entire expedition, a highest quality runestone mine. Kaur and Gillian were floored by the sheer wealth, with Gillian remarking that the young master always acted with reason. Belinda wondered aloud how he could have possibly known about such a place. The mercenaries began to celebrate, dreaming of the riches they would obtain once they returned home. However, a chilling voice suddenly echoed through the cavern, telling them they wouldn't be going anywhere because it was all over now. To their horror, the speaker was Manus, but his face was a decaying, blackened mask of death. Before anyone could react, the figure of Manus was obliterated in a sudden explosion of white mist. Ghislaine immediately ordered everyone to step back, swinging his heavy blade in a wide arc to clear the air. As the mist dissipated, the true horror of the cavern was revealed. Thousands of corpses, both human and monster, were piled high amidst the crystals. Ghislaine realized that the harmful gases from the rotting bodies had been hidden by the fog. He deduced that they had stumbled into the nest of a high-class monster, something the records in his previous life hadn't mentioned guarding this specific mine. He shouted for everyone to pay attention and prepare for battle, but he was interrupted by a towering presence. Emerging from the shadows was a colossal red serpent, its many eyes glowing with a malevolent light as it loomed over Ghislaine. He screamed for his men to scatter as the beast lunged. Ghislaine leapt into the air, his blade glowing with mana as he struck the serpent's head, but the weapon only managed to leave a shallow scratch. Kaur and Gillian watched in disbelief, shocked that even with mana, the creature's scales were nearly impenetrable. The monster hissed, spraying a geyser of corrosive green poison that Ghislaine barely evaded. The serpent slammed its massive body down, sending shockwaves through the cavern and forcing Ghislaine to block with everything he had. He was pushed back through the piles of bones as Belinda screamed out for him. The regular mercenaries were in a full-blown panic, terrified by the serpent's sheer size and its attempts to squash them all into the dirt. Gillian and the others tried to hold the line, but the chaos was absolute. Ghislaine stood amidst the bones, his blue eyes glowing with a cold, focused light. He identified the beast as a blood python, a creature he once considered impossible to hunt during this phase of his journey. He knew that logic dictated a retreat, as the chances of winning were incredibly low. However, he realized he had no time for delays. If he gave up now, everything he had sacrificed and built would become meaningless. He crushed a mana crystal in his fist, his heart and mana core erupting with a violent, glowing red intensity. With his resolve hardened by the weight of his past and future, he told the monster not to get in his way, declaring that he had far too many things on his back to fail now. A violent surge of pink mana erupted from his chest as he unleashed his third core, his eyes glowing with an intensity that matched the swirling energy. The blood python hissed, its red eyes narrowing as it prepared to strike. Ghislaine lunged forward, his blade leaving a glowing trail as he slashed at the creature's massive neck. The serpent retaliated with a blindingly fast tail sweep, which Ghislaine blocked with a heavy groan, the force of the impact vibrating through his entire frame. The monster let out a deafening roar that shook the very cavern. In the heat of the struggle, Ghislaine reflected that even when winning was unlikely, there were battles that one must not avoid. He thought of the weight of responsibility and the throne he was meant to protect, realizing that now was the time to fulfill his duty. He launched himself high into the air, aiming for the beast's head. Despite the ferocity of his assault, the blood python showed no signs of faltering. Ghislaine's mind raced, realizing that keeping his third core active for a long period was far too risky and that his mana would be depleted before he could kill the monster at this rate. Suddenly, his elite guard and the mercenaries arrived at the front lines, with Belinda, Gillian, and Kaur leading the way. They called out to their young lord, asking if he was alright and begging him to escape to safety while they held the beast back. Ghislaine didn't hesitate, commanding them all to leave this place immediately. The mercenaries were stunned, asking what he meant, but Ghislaine spoke with cold logic, stating that even he couldn't guarantee their safety in a battle against such a massive monster and that he simply could not afford to lose them here. Belinda looked at him with wide, trembling eyes, asking what would happen to him. She knew that everything he had shown so far had been close to a miracle, yet she couldn't understand why he was going this far for them. The serpent sprayed another geyser of lethal green poison, forcing the soldiers to duck behind their shields as Ghislaine screamed for them to leave quickly. The corrosive liquid hissed against their armor, but the men refused to move. One of the veteran mercenaries stepped forward, pleading to be allowed to fight alongside him. He noted that they had never met an employer like him and that he had saved their lives so many times already that there was no way they could leave him behind. Kaur grinned through the danger, remarking that once that damned snake was gone, the treasure would be theirs. Gillian braced his massive shield, telling his young lord that they would draw its attention and create an opening. He asked Ghislaine to trust them just as they had trusted him. Ghislaine looked at his loyal followers, his expression softening as he processed their resolve. He quickly analyzed the beast's massive size and lethal poison, knowing its extremely sturdy crimson scales would deflect even blades imbued with mana and that a single successful attack from the monster would mean death. However, he noted a weakness, telling his team that they could inflict damage if they focused their attacks on the serpent's smashed right eye and any gaping injuries. He raised his sword high, addressing the Forest of Beasts expedition team with a final command to let everyone return alive. The men let out a unified shout of agreement and charged. Belinda and Kaur lunged at the creature's flanks while Gillian smashed his axe into its side. Ghislaine realized that not everything went his way even if he knew the future, but he also knew that if he didn't take action, many would die. He refused to let that happen because he was the only one who knew the true future of this land. With a final, explosive burst of mana, he drove his blade deep into the serpent's head, declaring himself the future of Perdium. The The scene shifted far from the dark forest to the pristine halls of Castle Perdium. A noble named Albert slammed his fist onto a desk, shouting that Ghislaine had committed a serious crime by ignoring the order not to enter the forest. Another man, Homern, sat nearby, watching as the elder Duke Perdium tried to remain calm. Homern remarked that they already knew the young lord was unruly and suggested that Ghislaine only acted as though he was the lord of the land because of the duke's long absence. They noted it had been 2 weeks since the expedition entered the woods and complained that they could have stopped him earlier had Scoven not made a false report. They wondered why a knight like Scoven would risk his status for the young master. Albert urged the duke to take action before Ghislaine caused even more trouble, insisting that he be imprisoned and punished the moment he returned. The duke looked down at his tea, whispering his son's name with a heavy heart. Suddenly, a guard named Randolph burst into the room, shouting for the lords to come down and see what was happening. When asked what the matter was, Randolph announced that young Lord Ghislaine had returned. The nobles stood in shock as the heavy castle gates groaned open. Ghislaine walked through the threshold, his red cloak tattered and his sword at his side, returning to his home as a conqueror. Inside the quiet, sun-drenched halls of Castle Perdium, the air was thick with a heavy silence as Duke Perdium sat across from the advisors Albert and Homern. Ghislaine stood before them, his hair messy and his shirt stained from the journey, but his eyes remained calm. He looked at the older man sitting in the center and simply announced that he was home. The Duke stared back with a stern expression, reminding his son that he had clearly stated he would not permit the development of the Forest of Beasts. Ghislaine lowered his head slightly, offering a soft apology but maintaining that the mission had to be done. Homern snapped at the youth, accusing him of downright ignoring his father's orders and committing a serious crime. Albert added his own condemnation, shouting that Ghislaine could have lost his life and allowed the monsters to invade their territory. Ghislaine countered firmly, pointing out that as they could see, he was alive and the monsters had not invaded a single inch of their land. The advisors were taken aback by his audacity, asking if he found the situation funny. The Duke leaned forward, conceding that they could let the forest incident pass since no trouble had occurred, but then he threw a letter onto the table. He asked if Ghislaine had any excuse for the message from Count Rayfold. Ghislaine picked up the parchment, reading the accusations that he had threatened Lady Amelia and extorted 20,000 gold from the estate support fund. The Duke warned that the Count was furious and had decided to cut off all support and cancel the engagement. Ghislaine processed the news, realizing that Amelia had successfully manipulated the Count's greedy mindset. He understood that if she was willing to join hands with her enemy just to screw him over, she would stop at nothing. He knew the leverage he once held over her was now useless and realized that time was not on his side. The Duke demanded that Ghislaine say something, asking him to return the 20,000 gold immediately to manage the night order. Ghislaine looked his father in the eye and stated plainly that he had used it all. The room fell into a stunned silence before Ghislaine added that every gold coin went into the development of the forest. The nobles were livid, accusing him of wasting a fortune on a useless, monster-infested woods. They called him a filthy criminal who had sold the future of the land with his own hands and demanded he be tied down and thrown into jail. Ghislaine remained unmoved, telling them not to worry because he would provide the support fund himself, including the 20,000 gold he had spent. The Duke asked what he meant, and Ghislaine simply called out for Belinda. The silver-haired maid entered the room, carrying a heavy wooden chest which she placed on the table. When Ghislaine opened the lid, a brilliant, pulsating blue light filled the entire solar. The nobles gasped in disbelief as they stared at a massive pile of highest-quality runestones. They stammered, wondering where he could have found such rare items and if this was truly what the gold was used for. Ghislaine confirmed they had mined them from the Forest of Beasts. While the Duke admitted it was a fortune, he argued it still wasn't enough to run the entire land. Ghislaine smirked, telling them this wasn't the end of it. He led them to the balcony, pointing down at a massive caravan entering the courtyard. The wagons were overflowing with blue crystals, and the men were shouting orders to be careful not to scratch the runestones. Mercenaries were busy gathering piles of dirus ant hides and other valuable monster byproducts. The advisors were horrified and amazed, wondering how he obtained all of this in a mere 2 weeks. Homern asked his brother if he was seeing things correctly, while the Duke questioned Belinda if this truly came from the recent expedition. She confirmed it, adding that the youth led the entire force and that what they saw was only a fraction of what remained in the mine. Ghislaine declared that the reason for the expedition was to help the land, so it was only right that the wealth be used for that purpose. The Duke looked at the ledgers and admitted that with this amount, they would no longer have to struggle with lack of funds. He acknowledged his son's work, but Ghislaine cut in, stating there were a few conditions for the support. He demanded the immediate release of Scoven and Ricardo, noting they only followed his orders. Secondly, he insisted they continue to prohibit civilian access to the forest to prevent unnecessary rumors from causing trouble. Lastly, he stated that he would take care of recruiting and managing the territory's security forces himself to avoid any future interference. Albert erupted in protest, accusing Ghislaine of trying to maintain a private army and plotting something sinister. Ghislaine looked at the treasurer with a cold smile, telling him he was misunderstanding the situation. He reminded them that he was laying out the necessary conditions to provide the financial support that would replace the Rayfold funds. He asked Albert if he was truly okay with disrupting the future of Perdium over a trivial issue. The advisor turned to the Duke, begging him to say something, but the Duke remained silent. Suddenly, a commotion broke out as Gillian and Kaur approached the group. The mercenaries greeted their young lord, reporting that the loading process was almost complete and that the monster parts were being preserved as instructed. Duke Perdium and Randolph watched the newcomers with narrow eyes. Randolph noted noted that the mercenaries were individually formidable and possessed an overwhelming presence, admitting he had no clue how the young lord had such men under him. The Duke saw them as an elite force and realized that Ghislaine must have put in an incredible amount of effort to lead such unruly warriors. Ghislaine credited his men, stating that the expedition wouldn't have prevailed without them. The Duke closed his eyes, finally deciding to let the matter slide. He warned Ghislaine that if he defied orders again, he would face the consequences, but then acknowledged him as the successor who would inherit the land. He noted that Ghislaine possessed the spirit of the Northern Wolf, the alias given to the Counts of Perdium who guarded the frontier. Ghislaine watched his father walk away, reflecting on the man's past as a lonely hero who protected the kingdom through poverty and war, only to meet a miserable, forgotten death. He was determined to change that. Kaur and Belinda approached him, asking if they were heading straight back to the castle to rest. Ghislaine told them not yet, ordering them to have everything ready for a quick departure. Belinda protested, noting he had overworked himself and needed to detoxify from the blood python's poison. Ghislaine stood on the cliffside, looking down at the town. He told her that word of the runestones would spread quickly to those who wanted to invade, and he needed to expand his power as fast as possible. He vowed to reach a level where no one would dare challenge him, but as he spoke, his strength finally failed. His vision blurred, and his body went limp, falling forward into the dirt as his companion screamed his name in a panic. High within a moonlit spire, a messenger pigeon descended through a stained glass window, delivering a dire missive to a figure shrouded in shadow. The parchment confirmed that a portion of the Forest of Beasts had been developed and issued a chilling command to initiate a war with the Degard family and annihilate the House of Perdium. Only after the destruction was complete would the greater ducal house step in to claim the remains. The figure in the chair contemplated the annihilation of Perdium, realizing that the High Lords intended to turn the territory into a land without a master. He stood before his assembled council, declaring that the time had finally come for the ducal house to appoint a new owner for the region. When asked how many of their agents remained within the target territory, a subordinate confirmed that 2 retainers and a single knight were still in place. The leader ordered the 2 retainers to be sent immediately to the Degard territory, using the death of the supposedly missing young lord of Degard as the perfect justification to ignite a war. He then revealed that the supreme commander of the operation would be none other than Victor. The name sent a shockwave through the council, as they never expected their strongest card to be played so soon. One member remarked that if their previous agent, Frank, had succeeded, Perdium would have collapsed on its own. Another expressed concern, suggesting it was too soon to reveal such a hidden asset and questioning why the secretive ducal house was suddenly choosing to intervene so directly. The leader silenced them, stating that the discovery of the Forest of Beasts had changed everything. He declared that all decisions were made by Duke Delphine himself and commanded them not to question any orders. The blue-haired Count Harold Desmond stood tall, his amber eyes glowing with a cold light as he ordered his forces to prepare for the coming war, asking if anyone else was even aware of the shifting situation. In another part of the continent, the atmosphere was equally volatile. Emilia Rayfold let out a scream of pure fury that echoed through her luxurious estate, calling out Ghislaine Perdium's name with venom. Her aide tried to comfort her as she leaned against him, trembling with rage. She lamented that the man she once called a fool had not only secured a runestone mine but had done so using her own 20,000 gold coins. She recounted her failed attempts to stop him, from sending the wildcats to finish him off to bowing her head to her own father just to cut off Perdium's support. She felt like an absolute fool, but her aide reminded her that getting emotional was unlike her. Emilia took a deep breath, composed herself, and acknowledged that what was done could not be undone. She looked over a tactical map of the north, noting that while Perdium had the stones, they had not yet sold them. She analyzed the timeline, realizing they had only secured the mine 2 days prior, which was far too little time to establish a distribution network. She intended to exploit that weakness, knowing there was only one place in the northern region with the wealth and status to buy such high-quality stones: the Crimson Magic Tower, home to a powerful 7th Circle Archmage. She reasoned that because runestones were essential for research, the magic towers would be desperate for a steady supply. She ordered her aide to set up an ambush using the wildcats along the main routes leading to the tower. Her target was not Ghislaine himself, but the laborers transporting the cargo, intending to use hit-and-run tactics to isolate the shipment and steal the stones for herself. Her aide questioned the focus on the Crimson Tower, noting the Flame Magic Tower in Briven's territory was also an option. Emilia dismissed the concern, stating the Flame Tower was in decline and blinded by its past glory. She was certain that a man as obsessed with money as Ghislaine would choose the better deal at Crimson. With a predatory look in her red eyes, she vowed to take everything away from him. Back at Castle Perdium, Ghislaine lay unconscious in his chambers, his mind replaying the harrowing moments inside the blood python. He remembered how the predator had prepared to digest him, secreting a potent venom to dissolve its prey from the inside. He recalled how he had used the mana from his 3rd core to burn the acid on contact, though the process created a lethal, toxic atmosphere that would have killed any normal warrior. Driven by the need to protect his expedition and his future, Ghislaine had performed a feat of superhuman mana manipulation, directing the invading venom into his mana core and using its energy to neutralize the poison. The venom had served as an an alternative fuel, allowing him to withstand a mana explosion and survive the impossible. When he finally opened his eyes, he felt strangely refreshed. He recognized his room and remembered the moment his father had forgiven him before the darkness took him. Suddenly, his younger sister Elena lunged at him, wrapping her arms around him in a desperate hug. She scolded him for passing out for 2 whole days without saying a word, her eyes welling with tears. Ghislaine patted her head, calling her name softly before she turned and shouted to the hallway that he was finally awake. Left alone for a moment, Ghislaine processed the passage of time. He realized that despite the extreme first aid he had received from Belinda, his body was in remarkably good condition. He noted that his resilience had improved significantly and, more importantly, his total mana capacity had increased. He sensed a change in the very property of his mana, wondering if the energy of the blood python had permanently fused with his own during the detoxification process. It was a method of growth he had never encountered in his previous life, and he realized that while unintentional, risking his life had been worth it. He knew this new path could make him grow dozens of times faster than before. He stood and began to dress, knowing that selling the runestones was now his top priority. He expected that news of their haul had already spread and needed to organize the mercenaries immediately. He heard a knock at the door and told Belinda she didn't need to knock, but he froze when the door opened to reveal his father, Duke Perdium, standing there with Belinda and Elena. The Duke asked if he was alright after hearing about the python incident, and Ghislaine assured him he was fine. The Duke's expression remained stern as he looked at his son, stating that he had a request to make of him. Ghislaine stared back, wondering what his father could possibly ask of him now. Walking into the high-vaulted training facility of the castle, Ghislaine followed several paces behind his father. He reflected on how this was the first time he had ever shared one-on-one time with the man, noting that in his previous life, he had avoided him at all costs because he was terrified of being yelled at. The Duke came to a halt, his long silver hair catching the light as he turned slightly, apologizing for calling his son here so soon after he had regained consciousness. Ghislaine assured him that it was quite alright, stating that he was in excellent condition thanks to the 2 days of rest he had just received. Stepping forward, the youth asked what the specific request was that his father wanted to ask of him. The Duke stared back with a piercing blue gaze, his expression unreadable and silent for a long moment. As they stood in the quiet hall, Ghislaine remembered the words his mother had spoken to him when he was still a small child. She had told him that his father simply could not show his honest self to others, explaining that he felt he had to be an unshakable pillar for the people of the land. She had said he always put others before himself, and because of that burden, he never showed his true feelings, except for the one time he confessed his love to her. His mother urged him to understand that the Duke was just not good at expressing his emotions. The silence was broken as the Duke drew his blade, commanding Ghislaine to raise his weapon. Without hesitation, the youth complied, confirming his readiness with a respectful acknowledgement of yes, father. They stood at opposite ends of the sparring circle, and then the air exploded with movement. They clashed in the center of the hall, the sound of steel meeting steel echoing against the stone walls. Ghislaine parried a heavy blow, feeling the sheer weight of the strike. He realized this was the true strength of his father's sword, noting that the strikes were forged with the raw power required to subdue the savage barbarians of the north, yet tempered with the gentleness needed to protect all. They traded a flurry of strikes, the Duke moving with a speed and precision that tested Ghislaine's every reflex. After a final exchange that pushed them both back, the Duke lowered his guard slightly, acknowledging that his son had improved a lot. Ghislaine thanked him, catching his breath as the mana around them settled. However, the Duke's praise was followed by a sharp critique. He questioned why Ghislaine was loosening his sword pressure slightly when they were locked in a blade clash. He noted that while Ghislaine seemed to have the strength and reflexes to take down the massive monsters of the forest, his intent would become too easy for an opponent to read if he wasn't careful. Ghislaine pondered the advice, admitting to himself that he usually just got a feel for his opponent's movements as the fight progressed. He realized that this was the first time someone had ever given him formal guidance. His current swordsmanship was entirely instinctual, born from the raw combat and experience of his past life, and there were likely fundamental things he had overlooked because he never followed formal training. His father had pointed them out precisely, making him aware of his flaws. Ghislaine had always believed he only had himself to rely on, struggling through everything alone, but he began to think that receiving guidance wasn't such a bad thing after all. He looked at his father with newfound respect and thanked him for the teaching. The Duke's expression softened further as he admitted that he had honestly intended to scold his son today. He told Ghislaine that no matter how great his recent contribution was, the fact remained that he broke the rules. He warned that if everyone started disregarding established laws under the pretense of achieving results, the only thing that would follow is greater chaos. But then he acknowledged that Ghislaine had changed. Unlike the past incidents where the boy had caused trouble in a reckless pursuit of merit, the Duke could see that he was now looking towards something much greater. He encouraged Ghislaine to keep doing as he was now, telling him to think of Perdium and those around him as he fulfilled his responsibilities as a successor. Ghislaine took the word responsibility to heart, but then remembered the initial reason they were there. He asked his father what the request was, noting that he still hadn't told him. The Duke looked away sheepishly, his face turning slightly red as he cleared his throat and asked if Ghislaine happened to have any extra funds. Sometime later, Ghislaine traveled back to the Forest of Beasts post. He arrived at the camp to find the massive, severed head of the blood python still on display, surrounded by his loyal mercenaries. The men cheered at his arrival, shouting that the employer had returned and noting that he he was looking much healthier. Ghislaine smiled, asking them all if they had been well. Gillian and Kaur stepped forward, with Kaur asking if the young lord had finally gotten better. Ghislaine apologized for making them wait so long before turning his focus toward the massive ex-mercenary captain. He asked Gillian how Rachel was doing, and the old warrior's lone eyes shimmered with emotion. Gillian spoke with deep gratitude, stating that he never thought he would see the day his daughter could walk again, and he credited it all to the young lord. Ghislaine was glad to hear the news, but his expression soon turned serious. He gathered Belinda, Gillian, and Kaur for a private meeting, telling them there was something vital he had to share. He dropped the bombshell that their land was currently in grave danger. The three subordinates reacted with shock as Ghislaine recounted everything that had happened behind the scenes. He told them about the day Elena was attacked and how he had stopped the conspirators from killing her and using her death to start a war. He explained how he had discovered the corpse of the Degard young lord and revealed the existence of the powerful factions that were currently eyeing Perdium. He warned that there were people surveilling them right now who had been active for a long time, and that they had neither the time nor the resources to properly prepare for an attack. Belinda realized why he had been in such a hurry, admitting she thought they could catch their breath after securing the runestones. Kaur let out a short laugh, remarking that between the forest and a coming war, this land never gave him a chance to be bored. Gillian agreed, noting that if what Ghislaine said was true, then this would be the perfect time for an enemy to target a territory known for weak military forces and poverty, especially now that it possessed a highly valuable resource like a runestone mine. Ghislaine confirmed that their enemies would not leave them alone. Belinda suggested they should go tell the vassals or his father immediately, but Ghislaine refused, stating it was not yet time. He pointed out that considering Elena's own bodyguards had betrayed her, there could easily be traitors among the vassals as well, so they had to keep this information among themselves for now. He noted that by saving Elena, he had bought some time, but now that the mine was found, there was no reason for the enemies to remain still. He warned that it would be a tough fight, but the inner circle remained unshaken. Kaur told him to just order them around, noting that staying around him had been a lot of fun, while Gillian reaffirmed that he had already sworn his life to him and would fight until the very end. Belinda added that she was the one who was going to protect him, and she wasn't about to stop now. Ghislaine looked at his map, identifying the biggest threats to Perdium as the Delphine ducal family, along with Count Desmond and Amelia Rayfold, who were taking orders from them. He vowed not to let things go the way they intended and announced their next move. They would head to the Flame Magic Tower. Kaur was excited at the prospect of finally selling the stones and getting rich, but Belinda questioned the choice. She noted that while the Flame Magic Tower was closer, the Crimson Magic Tower was much more powerful and would likely pay a higher price for the cargo. Ghislaine explained that he chose the Flame Tower specifically because it would cause less friction. Gillian understood the logic, noting that transporting high-value goods like runestones was bound to attract unwanted guests and that staying one step ahead of the enemy was the only rational course of action. Belinda agreed that there could be an ambush just like last time. Ghislaine reflected on the current state of the magic world, noting that ever since Delmuth of the Crimson Magic Tower became a 7th Circle Archmage and made his tower's name known, the Flame Magic Tower had been on a downward spiral and was currently blinded by its past glory. He believed it was more profitable to sell the runestones in a place like Crimson, but he was choosing Flame for a very specific reason. He looked out toward the horizon, stating that he was going there because of her. Far away, at the majestic and ancient Flame Magic Tower, a young woman with long black hair sat in the center of a massive cluttered library. Surrounded by endless stacks of books, she gripped her wooden staff and looked up at the ceiling, wondering to herself when the light that Professor Renato had once mentioned would finally come for her. Most people miss the real story. Subscribe if you want to see everything. Riding atop a white horse, Ghislaine looked up at the towering architecture and noted that they had finally reached the Flame Magic Tower. Behind him, the mercenaries were awestruck, with the massive Gordon and the veteran soldiers whispering about how huge the place was, admitting they had only heard rumors of its scale but never expected to see it in person. Even Kaur was impressed, remarking with a smirk that just by seeing the quality of life in the surrounding town, it was clear that this land was completely different from the poverty of Perdium. As they moved through the bustling streets, they passed open-air workshops where magic scrolls were being produced in massive quantities, the air thick with the scent of parchment and ozone. The mercenaries pointed in wonder as mages in deep purple robes performed demonstrations, manifesting glowing blue slabs of mana in the air. One soldier asked what they were doing, noting he had never seen magic actually being cast before. The mages, however, cast cold glances at the travel-worn mercenaries. With a flick of their staves, they cast a concealment spell, and the entire group of mages vanished into thin air. The mercenaries jumped in shock, shouting that they had disappeared, while Ghislaine remained calm. He explained that it was a simple spell to conceal their appearance and noted that it seemed the mages did not welcome their presence. He barked at his men to stop acting like fools. Belinda looked around the wealthy Brivant territory, acknowledging that even though the tower had been pushed down from the top of the industry, it was still an amazing sight, as this land was one of the richest in the kingdom. Ghislaine looked at the prosperous streets and noted that it was only rich on the surface, privately thinking that no one would have guessed that this magic tower, once at its peak, would eventually fall into total ruin. The caravan arrived at the main gate of the inner tower, where Ghislaine noted that it took a while just to reach the entrance because the grounds were so vast. Belinda looked around in confusion, wondering where the gatekeepers were, only to find several sets of ornate silver armor slumped on the ground like discarded shells. Suddenly, a voice boomed from the ramparts, telling them to back off. Before their eyes, the armor pieces jerked to life, infused with blue mana and reassembling themselves into standing sentries. The puppet knights crossed their heavy halberds in front of the gate, blocking the path as the voice declared that not just anyone could enter the magic tower. A mage in a hooded robe appeared on the balcony above, commanding them to reveal their identity and their business. Belinda noted with a hint of annoyance that the mages were controlling the armor like puppets, while Kaur grumbled about them not even coming down to greet their guests properly. Gillian stepped forward, announcing with a booming voice that the man before them was Ghislaine Perdium, the young lord of Perdium, and demanded that the trade officer be brought out as they had brought fine goods. The mage on the wall looked down with disdain, stating flatly that they were not buying. Belinda tried to protest, telling him he hadn't even looked at their cargo yet, but the mage mocked them. He asked if Perdium wasn't just that beggar's land in the north, claiming that anything from such a place was likely just low-rank monster materials or garbage potions. He told them to get lost, calling them a waste of time, and ordered the puppet armor to advance. Belinda snapped back, asking who he was calling beggars and telling him to get down here, while Kaur looked to Ghislaine, asking what the young lord wanted to do. Ghislaine didn't lose his temper. Instead, he looked up at the arrogant mage and asked if he was absolutely sure about his decision. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a shimmering blue crystal, asking the man if he truly called himself a mage. Surely he would know what this was. The mage's eyes widened in absolute shock as he recognized the high-quality runestone. He gasped, realizing that if that one stone was real, then the entire covered caravan behind them might be filled with the same treasure. Ghislaine asked with a smug smile if they were still not buying. The tone of the tower changed instantly. A man named Sylvain, the trade officer, came rushing out to the red-carpeted hall, groveling and offering his deepest apologies for not recognizing such esteemed guests. He introduced himself and promised to assist with anything they needed. Ghislaine pointed toward the wagons, noting they had brought quite a lot, and stated that he needed someone who would take responsibility until the end of the deal, so he wanted to meet the tower master himself. Sylvain was staggered by the request, but he quickly understood the scale of the transaction and ordered the guests to be guided to the reception while he informed the master. Belinda huffed with satisfaction, noting that they should have had that attitude from the start instead of mocking them. As they walked through the grand corridors, Ghislaine noticed a strange mist drifting through the air and asked if something was the matter. Sylvain assured him it was just a common occurrence during magic research and told him not to pay it any heed. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a harsh voice. Ghislaine saw a young woman with long black hair being thrown onto the floor, her books and staff scattered around her. A young, green-eyed mage named Alfoy stood over her with a sneer, reminding her that he had told her never to set foot in the laboratory again. He mocked her, saying she was just taking up space for no reason since she couldn't even use magic. Alfoy boasted that he was the future successor of the tower and a third circle master, questioning why her teacher had even brought her here in the first place. He told her to be grateful that the tower master provided her with a place to sleep. The girl, clutching her staff, whispered a weak protest about having the right to use the lab because she was a mage too. Alfoy's expression turned cruel as he asked if she was really a mage, then suggested they treat her like one. He conjured a swirling ball of orange fire, stating that she should be able to use a defensive spell to deal with a basic offensive one. He launched a first circle fire sling directly at her face as she cowered in terror, crying out for a defense she couldn't manifest. Before the flames could reach her, Ghislaine blurred into motion. With a single, lightning-fast draw of his sword, he sliced the fireball clean in half, the embers dissipating harmlessly into the air. Alfoy stared in disbelief, wondering who could have sliced his magic in half, while Ghislaine stood over the girl, asking with a cold tone if this was what they called magic research in the Flame Magic Tower. Deep inside the Tower Master's meeting room, a man named Hubert sat with his head in his hands, lamenting the fact that they were running dangerously low on runestones. He worried that the gap between them and the Crimson Tower would only get wider at this rate and demanded to know what the elders had been doing. The elders fired back, reminding Hubert that every time they tried to secure a distribution line, he had insisted on putting it on hold to buy luxury goods and trinkets for networking with nobles. They pointed out that while runestones were a problem, the real issue was that the Crimson Tower Master had reached the 7th circle while Hubert remained at the 6th. Hubert exploded in rage, telling them not to talk about Delmuth and claiming he could reach the 7th circle in no time if he just had more runestones. He worried that Delmuth was buying up all the stones for himself just to spite him. Their argument was interrupted as Sylvain burst into the room without knocking, screaming that someone had brought in a massive amount of runestone. Outside in the hall, the situation had escalated. Alfoy was pinned against the wall by Belinda's mana threads, his face pale with fear as she asked him how he dared to attack her young master. The doors to the meeting room flew open and Hubert charged out, his long white hair flying as he screamed for everyone to stop and demanded to know what in the world was going on in his tower. Vanessa looked up with wide eyes, whispering the master's title in surprise. Ghislaine glanced at the pinned student and calmly told Belinda to release him. With a swift flick of her wrist, Belinda retracted her mana threads, and Alfoy collapsed to the floor with a pathetic gasp. The young mage scrambled toward Hubert, calling out for his teacher in a desperate, trembling voice. He threw himself at the master's robes, lying through his teeth as he claimed that intruders had suddenly attacked him while he was simply trying to prevent Vanessa from entering the laboratory. He acted as though he were a protector, claiming he only wanted to keep the girl safe since she lacked any mana. Belinda scoffed at the display, mocking the third circle mage for crying like a little girl. Alfoy snapped back, insisting that he was a man, even as he huddled behind his teacher. From her place on the floor, Vanessa clutched her staff and tried to explain that she only wanted to use the laboratory for her studies, but she was ignored. Ghislaine stared at the black-haired girl, his eyes narrowing as he confirmed his suspicions about her identity. In his mind's eye, he saw a vision of her future self, a scorched and powerful figure known as the Red Nightmare. He realized that this was how she appeared before her descent into that terrifying legend. Hubert, however, was done listening. A violent aura of orange flames erupted around his body, and he screamed that he would burn the intruders to a crisp for dare trying to harm his student. Belinda felt the heat intensifying and whispered to the young master that the situation was becoming dangerous. Ghislaine remained unfazed by the master's magical pressure. He offered a short apology for the late introduction and introduced himself properly as Ghislaine Perdium, the heir of the Perdium family. He stated calmly that he had come specifically to trade runestones. Hubert paused, his anger transitioning into confusion. Alfoy laughed at the claim, questioning how someone like him could possibly have such treasures. Ghislaine simply smiled, informing them that he had prepared the cargo in front of the castle and asked if they would like to go see for themselves. The group moved to the massive outer gates, where a line of wagons waited. The mages stood in stunned silence as the covers were drawn back, revealing 10 cartfuls of shimmering blue crystals. The elders gasped, wondering where a northern lord could have possibly obtained such a massive amount. Hubert's eyes reflected the blue glow as he laughed maniacally, realizing this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to finally crush the Crimson Magic Tower. But as quickly as his excitement flared up, Hubert's expression turned cold and calculating. He let out a forced cough, claiming he had expected more and noting that the quality didn't seem very good. Kaur growled in frustration, wondering if the bastard knew how hard they had worked to secure the hall. Vanessa tried to intervene, noting that one card alone contained enough stones to last the tower for weeks, but Hubert barked at her to be quiet and get back inside. He cursed the late Professor Renato for leaving such a nuisance behind. Ghislaine watched the display in silence, sensing Hubert's attempt to manipulate the deal. The tower master winked at his elders, who immediately fell into line. One elder adjusted his hat and suggested that since the stones came from such a poor territory, there was a high possibility they were fakes. They argued that they shouldn't just take the seller's word for it, claiming the market was full of scammers. Belinda shouted in indignation, asking how they could call the stones fakes after everything they went through. Ghislaine, however, merely nodded and stated that if the Flame Magic Tower truly wasn't interested, they would leave. He turned back to his team and ordered them to go find someplace else. Hubert's cool facade shattered instantly. He reached out, frantically telling them to hold on as they began to walk away. He pulled his head mage aside, whispering urgently and receiving a frantic nod in return. Hubert then turned back with a forced, wide smile, claiming that out of the generosity of his heart, he would buy them all. He added the caveat that because they had gone through so much trouble, he would take them off their hands slightly below market price. Ghislaine stopped in his tracks, informing the master that he was misunderstanding the situation. He turned to Kaur and ordered him to take all the carts back to the gates, leaving only one behind. Kaur was confused, asking if they hadn't planned on selling everything. Ghislaine gave him a knowing look, which Kaur quickly caught onto. The red-haired mercenary captain smirked, apologizing for forgetting their original plan, before ordering the men to haul the wagons away. Hubert watched in horror as his fortune began to roll out the gate. Ghislaine told the master that his subordinates had made a mistake by bringing too much, as their actual destination was the Crimson Magic Tower and they only needed a bit of travel money from a single cart. The mention of his rival tower sent Hubert into a cold sweat. He stammered that he was just joking around to make their first meeting less awkward and urgently invited everyone up to the meeting room for a chat. Ghislaine agreed, and soon the parties were seated in the lavish tower master's chambers. Hubert introduced the elders as Fifth Circle mages, but Ghislaine remained unimpressed. He remarked that it was expected for the second strongest tower in the north to have such people. Hubert bristled at the insult, insisting that the Flame Magic Tower was still the strongest, but Ghislaine dismissed the claim as irrelevant. Belinda and Kaur exchanged worried glances, wondering if the young master was intentionally trying to piss the master off. Hubert finally demanded a price, warning that Ghislaine wouldn't get a better deal anywhere else. Ghislaine held up 2 fingers and demanded double the market price. The room erupted in shock, with the elders screaming that he didn't know how to negotiate and that a compromise was required. Ghislaine maintained his cold gaze, stating he simply felt he needed double from the flame tower. Hubert's expression turned murderous, his eye glowing red as he warned the kiddo to watch himself. He claimed it pissed him off to see clueless brats flailing in a world they didn't understand. Ghislaine didn't blink, meeting the threat with total silence. Hubert eventually stood up, claiming he would show mercy one more time and offered slightly above market price. Ghislaine rose from his chair, saying he didn't think the tower wanted to buy them after all. He stated that even double was a discounted price and announced his departure for the Crimson Tower. Hubert let out a desperate scream for him to stop, begging him not to be in such a rush and claiming he was willing to negotiate. Ghislaine waited for the final surrender. Hubert looked at his elders and then back to Ghislaine, admitting he had guts and finally agreeing to buy at double the market price. But Ghislaine countered again, stating that for double price, he would only sell one cart. The mages were livid, demanding he sell everything he brought, but Ghislaine explained his strategy. He noted that if he told the Crimson Tower that Hubert paid double, they would likely pay triple to outdo their rival. Hubert was trapped by his own greed and rivalry. He screamed that they would buy it all at triple the price, and Ghislaine sat back down, acknowledging that now they were finally talking. Hubert rushed toward the treasury to gather the funds immediately, fuming internally about being played by a country bumpkin but knowing he needed the stones. As he reached the door, Ghislaine called out for him to hold on a minute. The youth stated he hadn't finished telling him all of his conditions. Hubert turned around with a face purple with rage, demanding to know what it was this time. Ghislaine looked him dead in the eye, his gaze cold and unwavering, and stated that his final condition was for Hubert to give Vanessa to him. Ghislaine sat with a centered, unwavering gaze as Master Hubert stared back in stunned silence, repeating the name Vanessa in disbelief. The young lord confirmed his demand, stating firmly that he wanted the child as his exclusive mage. In that moment of quiet tension, Ghislaine's mind drifted back to a past life, finding himself seated around a crackling campfire with an old comrade named Claude. As they watched the meat sizzle over the orange embers, Claude complained about his missing arm while teasing Ghislaine about whether he had heard of the legend known as Vanessa the Red Nightmare. Ghislaine had repeated the name with a distant look, listening as Claude described a terrifying mage who had attained the 7th circle and burned down the entire northern region of Luthania. Ghislaine found the title flashy, but Claude's expression turned grim as he explained that the woman was a walking disaster who had gone completely mad. He revealed that she was a mage who had bypassed the traditional study of magic circles, choosing instead to learn a forbidden mana cultivation technique. This choice made her a target for countless subjugation requests from the High Lords. Ghislaine pondered the mystery, wondering why a mage would choose such a path. In the present, he reflected that in his previous timeline, this meeting never truly happened because the Vanessa he eventually found was as good as dead, having completely lost control of her runaway magic. Despite her tragic end, he recognized that she possessed the raw talent to surpass almost anyone, and he knew that with just a small amount of his guidance, her talent would finally flourish. He resolved that he would secure her recruitment for certain this time. Back in the Tower Master's meeting room, Gillian and Kaur looked down at the shivering girl clutched to her staff, noting that she didn't seem strong at all. Belinda leaned in and whispered a reminder to her young master that if he wanted to add new people to their inner circle, he should tell her in advance. Hubert and his elders leaned close to one another, whispering frantically about how this was a great opportunity to rid themselves of a useless nuisance while appearing to honor their loyalty to her late teacher, Renato. Hubert smoothed his robes and put on a facade of concern, claiming that while the tower valued her, they would accept the request. Ghislaine didn't stop there, adding that he also required the tower to dispatch battle mages of the 3rd circle or higher to Perdium for 1 year. Hubert's fake smile evaporated instantly as he realized the mages were meant for a territorial war. He stood up with a roar as a violent dome of orange flame exploded around him, his eyes glowing with a murderous red light. He screamed that mages affiliated with magic towers were forbidden from intervening in the wars of nobles and accused Ghislaine of being an ignorant fool who disregarded the laws of the kingdom. He saw the request as an ultimate insult to the flame magic tower, declaring that the boy wouldn't even have ashes left behind after he was through with him. The mercenaries braced themselves against the intense heat, recognizing the overwhelming pressure of a 6th circle mage, while Belinda and his guards prepared to draw their weapons to protect their lord. Ghislaine didn't move an inch, his eyes cold as he looked through the fire and told Hubert he would regret his actions. He dropped a tactical bombshell, revealing that he had discovered a massive runestone vein in his territory that was dozens of times larger than the carts they had already seen. He noted that the information was already spreading across the north and asked Hubert what he thought that meant. The master's flames flickered as Ghislaine explained that many factions would soon be coming for the mine. He clarified that Perdium wasn't looking for a war, but simply needed the tower's strength to protect the resource. In exchange, he offered an exclusive monopoly, promising that all runestones from the mine would be supplied only to the flame magic tower. The elders gasped as the reality set in. Hubert realized that with such a monopoly, it was only a matter of time before they overtook the Crimson Tower and reclaimed their spot as the strongest in the north. The master's rage vanished, replaced by calculated greed, and soon the two men were sharing a firm handshake to seal the deal. Later, inside his private study, Hubert informed a shocked Alfoy that he was being dispatched to the Northern Territory. Alfoy protested, wondering why he was chosen among all the other mages, but Hubert manipulated him by calling him the greatest talent in the tower's history. He claimed the role was for Alfoy's own future as the next tower master. He ordered the young mage to keep a close eye on the country bumpkins, to ensure they didn't smuggle stones elsewhere, and reminded him that if a war broke out, he should retreat immediately. He told Alfoy to simply endure the rural dump for a single year so they could become the #1 tower in the world. Alfoy accepted the mission with a sinister, arrogant grin, imagining himself as a future ruler while secretly harboring contempt for the mission. Sometime later, the group arrived at the gates of Perdium. Alfoy looked up at the stone walls with a sneer, labeling the castle as an old-fashioned rural dump that was merely practical rather than flashy. He walked toward Ghislaine in the courtyard, introducing himself as a third circle master and demanding the respect due to an heir of the tower. He spoke to Ghislaine as if he were a subordinate, telling the noble to do his best and stay alert. Ghislaine ignored the arrogance entirely, asking one pointed question. Where was Vanessa? Alfoy dismissively noted that she was behind them, bringing their bags. A moment later, the black-haired girl appeared at the edge of the courtyard, panting heavily as she walked barefoot across the rough ground. She was hauling 3 massive, heavy leather suitcases and a wooden chest, her body trembling under the weight. She dropped the bags with a heavy thud, bowing deeply as she greeted the young lord for the first time. Alfoy mocked her for taking so long and warned Ghislaine that he almost thought she wasn't coming. Ghislaine told Vanessa to unload the bags and come to him, but she hesitated, explaining that she hadn't finished her chores yet. Alfoy interjected, telling Ghislaine to leave her alone because that was all she had been doing at the tower anyway. He claimed since she couldn't use magic, she should at least be useful for manual labor. Without warning, Ghislaine's legs snapped out in a powerful kick, launching one of the heavy leather bags directly into Alfoy's face. The mage slammed into the dirt with a cry of pain as his companions stared in shock. Standing over the fallen mage, Ghislaine declared that Vanessa was no longer affiliated with the tower. She was his personnel, and no one was allowed to order her around. He warned Alfoy that he would let the insult slide once, but if it happened again, the mage would have to risk his life for it. Alfoy clutched his bloodied face, his eyes wide with a manic rage. He screamed at the top of his lungs, demanding to know how a noble dared to treat a third circle master like this. He claimed that even for a lord, Ghislaine had crossed the line and threatened to burn the entire territory to the ground in a single second. He called for the other mages to stand up and show their pride, but his words were cut short as Ghislaine snapped his fingers. Instantly, Gillian, Kaur, and a legion of elite mercenaries surrounded the mages with leveled weapons. The mages recoiled in terror at the barbaric sight, screaming for the treatment they deserved as elites. Ghislaine told Alfoy to shut up, reminding him that the treatment they received was irrelevant compared to their contract. He explained that through his deal with the Tower Master, he held full authority over them for a year. He mocked the noble mages, stating that in Perdium, they were nothing more than a reserve bundle of living mana. He told them to fulfill their roles obediently if they wanted to be treated well, leaving Alfoy speechless with humiliation. Ghislaine ordered Gillian and Kaur to take good care of the mages, and the 2 warriors shared a menacing smile as they closed in, promising to help the newcomers adapt to the harsh reality of their land. Vanessa watched the scene with hollow eyes before a scream from the distance snapped her attention back to her suitcases. Ghislaine walked to her side and softly told her that as his exclusive mage, she was never to take orders from anyone other than him. When she whispered that she was unworthy because she couldn't use magic, Ghislaine reached out his hand to her. Looking at her with a confident smile, he told her to follow him, promising that he would be the one to finally help her use magic. Walking together through the stone corridors of Castle Perdium, Ghislaine called out to Vanessa. The black-haired girl, still gripping her staff, looked up in surprise as the young lord asked how far she had managed to get in her magic studies. In a quiet, self-deprecating voice, she admitted she had studied up to the 5th circle, though it was only the theory. Ghislaine processed the information, noting that the 5th circle was an excellent level of knowledge. Vanessa's expression remained somber as she stated that it was all useless because she had never been able to feel mana since childhood. She looked away, recalling the years spent believing that hard work would eventually lead to results, only to realize that day would never come. With her teacher gone and her expulsion from the tower, she felt utterly worthless. Ghislaine scrutinized her, realizing that while she understood the principles behind magic, her body simply lacked the capacity for traditional activation. He knew magic required more than memorization. It required an interpretation of will. In his mind, he recalled the rumors of the Red Nightmare, the mage who learned a cultivation technique because she was crazy. A small smile touched his lips as he told Vanessa that from now on, he was going to teach her a mana cultivation technique. She was staggered by the suggestion, wondering why a mage would learn a technique usually reserved for warriors. He explained that both circles and mana cultivation techniques were based on controlling mana and asked if she had ever tried it. Vanessa trembled, stuttering that it was a crazy idea that could leave her magically crippled for life. Ghislaine met her fear with confidence, telling her simply to try it. They sat opposite one another on the polished floor of the hall. As Vanessa prepared herself, Ghislaine reflected on her previous life, remembering eyes filled with regret, rage, and hatred. He saw a vision of her future as a disaster that burned everything in her path, but he resolved that this time would be different. He was here to prevent her from falling into that endless abyss. Ghislaine reached out his hand, pressing it against her back as a brilliant blue mana flared between them. Vanessa let out a pained gasp, her body burning with a sudden, intense heat. Ghislaine barked a command, telling her to close her mouth because she was twisting her internal mana road. He informed her that the energy currently flooding her system was his own mana and told her not to let go of the sensation. He urged her to feel the flow as much as possible, guiding the energy as it stretched through every corner of her body, circulating along the edges and converging in the center. An explosive pillar of light erupted from her, shaking the foundation of the castle. Amidst the swirling mana, Vanessa's mind drifted to the past, remembering Master Hubert mocking her for not being able to cast a single spell. She recalled Professor Renato defending her with his life, claiming her talent was the catalyst for their proof of mana particles. She remembered her younger self crying, wishing she was more talented so Renato wouldn't have to leave the tower to find a cure for her. Her teacher had placed a hand on her head, telling her to lift her head and look at the sky, promising that one day light would find her. As the mana stabilized in the present, Vanessa looked at Ghislaine's outstretched hand through her tears, realizing that her teacher had been right and the light had finally come for her. The silence of a nearby inn at night was shattered by the sounds of a brutal brawl. A massive, wild-haired man laughed manically as he easily tossed seasoned warriors around like rag dolls, mocking them for thinking pieces of metal could stop him. His subordinates cheered from their tables, boasting that no one in the region could stop their boss. The massive man stepped outside to the water's edge, letting out a satisfied breath. Suddenly, a man in a feathered tricorn hat appeared in the shadows behind him, asking if his training was going well. The massive man turned his head as the visitor announced that Count Desmond had issued a mobilization order. The visitor called him by name, Victor, and watched as the warrior picked up a distinctive winged helmet. Victor secured the plate armor over his face, a single eye glowing through the visor as he accepted the command. He stated with a predatory calm that it was time to go, admitting he was just getting bored to death. Deep within the high vaulted chambers of Castle Perdium, Duke Swallotter sat at his heavy desk, his brow furrowed with exhaustion. He unfurled a scroll that carried the weight of a death sentence, reading a message stating that Gilmore Degard had been murdered by Ghislaine Perdium and that vengeance would be taken in blood. The Duke looked up with a grim expression, realizing that the inevitable had finally arrived, and he commanded his attendants to assemble the soldiers immediately. High above the ramparts, the wolf-crested flag of Perdium snapped violently in the wind as the narration confirmed that this was an official declaration of war. Inside the meeting hall, the advisors were in a state of absolute frenzy. Albert shouted that the Degardists must be out of their minds for claiming that Ghislaine had murdered Gilmore, especially since they had treated that family like their own for so long. They wondered what the enemy hoped to gain from such a fight, but Ghislaine spoke up with cold clarity, revealing that the true catalyst was the runestone mine. He explained that 2 vassals had been sent to the Degard territory while he was away at the magic tower, and they must have spread information about the discovery. The advisors recoiled at the bold accusation of betrayal, but the Duke turned his gaze toward his son. He noted that while it was common for actions taken for the sake of the land to lead to a crisis, it seemed as if Ghislaine had known this would happen all along. Albert dismissed the fear, boasting that they outnumbered the Degard army with far more experienced soldiers and swore they would pay for opposing them. His bravado was interrupted by a guard who burst into the room with urgent news, his face pale as he pointed toward the horizon. Randolph stood on the wall, his mouth agape as he announced that the enemy had already arrived. The nobles rushed to the battlements, staring out at a sea of yellow flags emblazoned with a black eagle. They watched in horror as a massive force moved across the snowy plain, led by a knight in gleaming white plate armor atop a dark warhorse. The Duke realized with a shudder that despite the declaration having just arrived, the enemy was already fully prepared and moving with impossible speed. A scout reported the confirming numbers, stating that the armed forces numbered around 6,000, with an additional supply unit of 1,000 troops. He added that multiple siege weapons had been identified and were already being constructed on the front lines. The advisors panicked, demanding to know where the Degardists got such an army since they were supposed to be as poor as Perdium. They began to argue about the reduction of funds for the military, but the Duke's voice cut through the chaos, telling them to get themselves together. He reminded them that quarreling would serve no purpose and ordered all troops to the castle walls. He commanded the gates to be closed and the citizens moved inside, declaring that the war had already begun. Across the field, Count Thomas Degard sat comfortably on his horse, humming a quiet tune to himself with a sadistic smile. He looked toward the castle and whispered to the memory of his son, Gilmore, noting that while the boy was a useless youth in life, he had managed to prove his worth after death by providing a pretext for conquest. He marveled at the incredible castle and called for Victor to follow him, intending to speak with his brother, Perdium, one last time. Standing atop the gatehouse, the Duke of Perdium shouted down at the valley, asking Tamos what the meaning of this treachery was. Tamos laughed, mocking the word treachery and reminding the Duke that his beloved son had died on this soil at the hands of the successor, Ghislaine Perdium. He claimed that any parent would be furious and offered a false peace, stating that if they surrendered now, things would end peacefully. Ghislaine watched the exchange with narrowed eyes, while the advisors screamed from the walls that the Count was lying until the very end and urged the Duke to end the conversation. Ghislaine reflected that even though he had saved Elena, he knew things would end like this since Gilmore had died anyway. Seeing the siege weapons, he realized the enemy intended to trample them completely, but he noted with a grim satisfaction that everything was going exactly as he had expected. Duke Swallotter stepped forward, his eyes suddenly glowing with a sharp blue mana as he declared firmly that his son did not kill Gilmore. He told Tamos that this was the only answer he would give and warned him that if he valued his life, he should return to his own land immediately. The raw commanding presence of the northern wolf silenced the field. Victor, hidden behind his winged helm, acknowledged the Duke as a renowned general, while Tamos wiped sweat from his brow, finding the pressure nearly unbearable. The Count eventually turned his army around, shouting back a threat that Swallotter would regret his foolish choice as they retreated to their camps. Albert and Homern began to squabble over command of the troops, desperate to wipe out the unorganized dogs and save their own lives. Ghislaine stood on the quiet wall beside his father, observing the Duke's inner chaos. He knew his father was struggling to process how the enemy had prepared such a large force so quickly and wondered who was assisting them from the shadows. Sensing his father's indecision, Ghislaine suggested they prepare for a defensive battle. The Duke looked at him with surprise as Ghislaine broke down the tactical reality. He noted that compared to the Degard army of 7,000, Perdium could barely muster 2,000 troops, a ratio of more than 3 to 1. He pointed out that the enemy was fully prepared and possessed high morale, and estimated it would take roughly 15 days for them to complete their siege weapons and begin a full-scale assault. He admitted that requesting reinforcements while holding the castle was the usual course, but he didn't see anything they could do beyond that. Ghislaine leaned in and whispered a secret plan to his father, causing the older man's eyes to widen in shock. Across the next 15 days, Ghislaine resolved to pour everything he had into turning the game around. In a private council with Gillian, Kaur, and Belinda, Ghislaine donned his black armor and announced his intention to ambush the enemy's supply units before the assault began. He explained that blocking the supply route would make continuing the war much more difficult for the enemy. Belinda worried about the eyes watching the castle, but Ghislaine turned to his captains. Kaur confirmed that as instructed, they had already stationed troops at the Forest of Beasts post so they could move undetected, while Gillian reported they had finished distributing special ponchos made from the hides of the Dirus Ents. He noted that the dark material was well suited for nighttime operations and camouflage. Ghislaine acknowledged that while a large army would be detected, an elite unit in camouflage could slip through. The only issue was the unknown location of the supply unit, so he turned to Belinda and asked her to find them. She accepted the dangerous role with a determined nod, though Ghislaine knew it required steeling oneself for the possibility of death. He looked at the last part of his plan, identifying his strongest card as the woman who would land the finishing blow, Vanessa. A few days later, at the Degard supply unit camp, a traitorous former vassal of Perdium named Fabro laughed as he drank wine. He boasted that with the war finally begun, he would soon be rewarded with land of his own. He toasted with another commander, celebrating the fact that siding with Count Desmond allowed them to rest in the back without risk. He raised his glass to the moon, saying goodbye to Perdium and claiming its land would soon be his. In the darkness outside the camp, the silence was broken only by the rhythmic breathing of horses. A soft smile played on Ghislaine's lips as he whispered that they arrived just in time. Behind him, Gillian, Kaur, and Belinda sat mounted and ready, noting the terrible, dark weather that made seeing anything impossible. Ghislaine agreed, remarking that it was perfect for an ambush. He lowered his visor, his armored fingers gripping his sword as he commanded his elites that no hostages were required and to simply kill them all. With his eyes glowing behind steel, Ghislaine unsheathed his blade and prepared to unleash a slaughter under the cover of the night. They smashed into the Degard supply camp with the force of a tidal wave, catching the enemy completely off guard. Panic rippled through the tents as the mercenaries scrambled for their weapons, screaming about an enemy ambush and wondering what the hell their sentries had been doing. Ghislaine's voice rang out over the clatter of steel and the cries of the dying, ordering the Perdium mercenaries to move according to the plan and not to spare a single man. Baron Fabro, the commander of the unit, stumbled out of his tent and demanded to know why his sentries hadn't raised an alarm, but his bravado crumbled when he saw his men being slaughtered where they stood. He shouted for his soldiers not to panic, reminding them that they still had 1,000 men on their side, but one of his terrified lieutenants delivered the crushing reality that over 70% of their force had already been killed in the initial strike. Seeing Gillian and Kaur carving through his ranks like reapers, Fabro decided to save his own skin, telling his men they needed to run because he refused to be killed before he could receive his reward. He tried to flee into the darkness, but his path was blocked by a silver-haired rider. Belinda looked down at the traitor with a chillingly calm expression, remarking that she didn't expect to see him here. Fabro's face went pale as he recognized her, stuttering her name in disbelief. As the fires spread and consumed the camp, the ground became littered with the charred and bloodied remains of the supply unit. Ghislaine sat tall on his horse as his captains brought the captured Fabro forward, the traitor's hands bound tightly behind his back. Belinda reported that this man was one of the vassals who had originally been sent as an envoy to the Degard territory, revealing that he had not only sold their secrets but was now serving as the commander of the enemy's logistical forces. Fabro threw himself at Ghislaine's feet, groveling and pleading for his life, claiming he was willing to surrender. Ghislaine stared down at him with a cold, unforgiving gaze, asking a single question: who was behind everything? The broken man quickly shifted the blame, revealing that it was the Desmond family who had masterminded the conspiracy. He claimed he had been threatened and forced to help, begging Ghislaine to remember his long years of service to Perdium. Ghislaine processed the information with a grim nod, having expected as much from the Desmonds. Fabro tried to bargain one last time, claiming that Count Degard would pay a generous ransom for him and suggesting the young lord see him as a profitable deal. Ghislaine nudged his horse forward and told the traitor to raise his head. Thinking he was being granted a second chance, Fabro laughed with relief, promising to spend the rest of his life serving Perdium. Mid-sentence, Ghislaine's blade blurred through the air, and Fabro let out a final, silent gasp before his head rolled away into the dirt. Ghislaine spoke to the dying embers, stating that he did not deal with the likes of such men. He declared that those who attacked Perdium would face nothing but death. Kaur approached his captain, asking what their next move would be. Ghislaine looked toward the distant horizon where the silhouette of the castle stood against the gray sky, announcing they would head straight back to their home. He reasoned that the main assault had likely begun by now, which meant all of the enemy's focus would be fixed on the walls. He intended to use that to their advantage, attacking the Dagardis from the rear to throw them into. Turning to his inner circle, he laid out the tactical split. Kaur and Belinda would support the left side of the castle wall while he would head to the right. He then looked at the massive Gillian and entrusted him with the main enemy forces, asking if he could handle thousands of troops with only a handful of men. Gillian grinned, the scars on his face tightening as he promised it would be no problem, stating it was his honor to fulfill the young lord's command. Kaur joked that Ghislaine was giving the old man the most fun part of the plan, while Belinda asked who would be in charge of defending the castle gate. Ghislaine turned his horse toward the battlefield, giving the strange command to leave the castle gate be. His companions were stunned into silence as he stared ahead, reflecting that this war would be the starting point that would change the entire history of Perdium. Back at the castle battlements, the air was thick with the white smoke of catapult strikes and the smell of sulfur. Duke Swallotter roared for his soldiers to prepare for another attack, barely holding the line as the Dagard forces swarmed the walls. Catapults launched massive projectiles that shattered the stone as the Duke ordered his archers to fire and prevent the enemy from getting close. The situation had become desperate, with soldiers screaming that there were just too many enemies and they were losing control of the ramparts. The Duke drew his sword and commanded the switch to close quarters combat, determined not to give them an inch of the wall. Watching from the rear of the yellow-bannered army, Thomas Dagard laughed with gleeful malice, claiming the war was already over and ordering his catapults to prepare for a second strike to hasten the takeover. Victor, the champion of the Dagardis, watched the castle with a single glowing eye through his winged helm. He noted the end of the legend of the Northern Wolf, admitting he had expected something more from a general of such renown. Inside the walls, Homer turned to his brother in a panic, shouting that while the walls were a problem, the main gate would be broken down any minute. The Duke replied with a stoic calm, telling him to leave the gate alone and to focus solely on protecting the wall. He asked Scovin why the reinforcements hadn't arrived, only to receive the grim report that every territory from Zambar to Rayfold had refused to send aid, citing internal matters, while their messengers to the Loges territory had all vanished. The Duke cursed them as ungrateful bastards as he continued to cut through the enemy ranks. The tide began to turn when a panicked scout rushed to Count Tamos, announcing that their supply units had been compromised. Tamos was shocked, refusing to believe the Perdium fools could possibly find their hidden base. He glared at the plume of black smoke rising in the distance, but Victor remained calm. The silver-armored knight noted that it seemed Perdium still possessed a mind capable of bold action, finding the development interesting. Tamos stammered, asking what they should do if they were cut off from their supplies, but Victor began to walk toward his horse, declaring that they needed no supplies. He confidently stated that they would simply take over the castle by the end of today. Tamos was floored by the claim, but Victor ignored him, watching as the Duke of Perdium personal force continued to stall the flank attacks. He gripped the hilt of his massive broadblade, realizing that while the walls held, the gate was the true path to victory. He commanded all forces to advance, declaring that today, they would break through the castle gate once and for all. Lined up with a sea of heavy cavalry behind him, Victor raised his massive sword and led the charge toward the heart of the Perdium defenses. Victor sat heavily atop his armored steed, his single blue eye glowing through the slit of his winged helm as he spoke to his horse, calling him Atten. He tightened his grip on a massive, ornate mace and announced his intention to personally head out and break through the castle gate. He ordered his men to stay and protect their position while he moved toward the front lines. The battle at the battlements reached a fever pitch as Dagard soldiers swarmed up ladders, their yellow banners clashing with the silver armor of the Perdium defenders. Duke Swallotter fought amidst the chaos, his blade slick with blood, when a panicked soldier pointed toward the clearing. The Duke watched in horror as massive wooden siege towers began to roll across the field. He cursed the enemy's preparation, wondering how they had managed to accurately calculate the height of their castle walls. Realizing they would not last if those towers reached the ramparts, he bellowed a command for the catapults to be readied. His crew confirmed they had just finished their preparations, and the Duke gave the order to fire, determined to stop the towers from approaching any further. A massive boulder was launched into the sky, trailing a wake of displaced air as it hurtled toward the enemy machinery. The Dagard soldiers below looked up in terror, realizing the projectile was going to land directly on them. Suddenly, a blinding flash of energy surged from the ground. Victor launched himself into the air, his mace glowing with a violent light as he intercepted the massive stone mid-flight, shattering it into harmless pebbles with a single strike. On the wall, Swallotter and Homern stared in absolute shock, unable to believe the shot had been intercepted by a single man. The Duke gazed down at the Silver Knight, realizing the monster they were up against as Victor mocked their resistance, stating there was no point in struggle because their demise was predestined. Victor then commanded the siege ram to charge, leading the way for the massive wooden structure to be pushed directly toward the main gate. Deep inside the castle courtyard, a group of mages sat in a circle around an intricate glowing magic array. Alfoy shouted in frustration, demanding that the lowly peasants let them go. He screamed that as mages, they were not supposed to be a part of this damned war. A scarred Peridium guard stood over them with a heavy shield, reminding them that this was an order from the young master and telling them to stay still. Ornate staff in hand, Vanessa watched the exchange in silence. Alfoy pointed toward the gate, noting that the enemy ram was already close and claiming the castle was already lost. Vanessa finally spoke up, her face resolute as she told him not to worry because she believed the young lord would surely prevail. Alfoy laughed at her, asking if she was going to continue listening to that lunatic's orders. Vanessa clutched her staff tight, her eyes dark with hidden power as she insisted that Ghislaine was not a lunatic. Her mind drifted back to a few days prior, when she had stood before Ghislaine in the training hall. She had apologized, admitting that while she could finally use magic, the tiny spark she mustered was all she could manage. Ghislaine had offered a gentle smile, telling her it was fine as long as she could use magic at all, promising that time would solve her lack of mana. He had then led her to the outer gate, where the mercenaries were busy digging deep pits. Vanessa had wondered why they were burying runestones, as the expensive crystals were meant to be used for trade. Alfoy, covered in dirt and sweat, had complained about being made to dig when there were others for the job, but Gordon had threatened to crush his skull if he didn't stop talking. Ghislaine had stared at the gate, calling the work preparation. He explained to Vanessa that the simplest tactic in war was to overpower the enemy with numbers, and no matter how much they struggled, the castle gate would surely be compromised eventually. However, he had promised her there was still a way to win. Vanessa had looked at the magic circle drawn over the buried stones, realizing it was meant for a massive mana transfer. Ghislaine had looked at her with total conviction, telling her he knew she could do it. Back in the present, the earth shook as the ram slammed into the wooden gates. Homer pointed out into the valley, shouting that a new squad had appeared. The Duke looked out, his heart leaping as he recognized the riders. Ghislaine led the charge, his cloak billowing in the wind as he roared his own name. To the side, Tomos screamed for Sir Victor as a reporting soldier announced that an unknown cavalry unit was launching a surprise attack from the rear on both flanks. Kaur and Belinda tore into the Degard rear line, while Ghislaine moved like a blur of steel. The enemy soldiers panicked, having heard that no reinforcements would come to Peridium's aid. One commander desperately ordered his men to fire at the young lord before he could reach them. Ghislaine didn't slow down. Instead, he seemed to fly across the battlefield, his blade glowing with a massive arc of blue mana. With one singular, superhuman strike, he cleaved through scores of soldiers, sending blood and armor flying into the air. The survivors were paralyzed by the sight, wondering if the man before them was even human. Ghislaine raised his sword high toward the sky, its blade shimmering with the refracted light of victory. He bellowed for the soldiers of Peridium to rise, announcing that their counterattack started right now. His voice carried across the field, signaling the beginning of the end for the Degard invasion. The tactical map shifted, showing Kaur and Belinda striking from the left, Ghislaine from the right, and a separate elite force pushing toward the center. Meanwhile, at the Degard main camp, the silence of the rear lines was shattered as Gillian led a brutal surprise assault. The enemy soldiers scrambled in fear, shouting that their main camp was under attack. Gillian, wielding his massive axe, ordered Gordon and Toron to spread out wide and disable the enemy's key facilities while he drew all of their attention. Gordon laughed as he saw the panicked faces of the invaders, noting that by the time they returned to their base, it would be reduced to nothing but ashes. Count Tomos Degard stumbled back in terror, his voice cracking as he asked what in the world was going on and why they were the ones being ambushed. His guards urged him to evacuate immediately, but a massive shadow loomed over them. Gillian rode forward, identifying the enemy commander as Count Tomos Degard and coldly announcing that he would be taking him hostage. Tomos let out a choked sound of fear as Gillian's axe blurred through the air, carving through the guards with such force that blood and steel sprayed across the snow. The Count realized with horror that the old man was incredibly strong. A high-ranking Degard knight in polished silver-plate armor intercepted the path, noting that Peridium had guts to attack the main base with such a small force. He introduced himself as Adin Praso and demanded that Gillian state his name. Gillian's eye glowed with a feral blue light as he replied that he had no name, declaring he was merely a weapon wielded by the Grand Duke of Peridium. On the left fortress wall, the combat was just as intense. Kaur and Belinda carved a path of destruction through the yellow-clad spearmen. Belinda moved like a silver phantom, her daggers leaving a trail of severed limbs and blood. She snapped at Kaur, telling him to stop splattering blood in her direction. Kaur laughed as he hacked another soldier down, retorting that the old lady should handle that herself since he didn't have time to worry about it. Belinda's eyes flared with rage at being called an old lady, her killing intent spiking as she redoubled her assault. Simultaneously, on the right fortress wall, Ghislaine sat tall on his horse, his blade a constant blur of blue mana. The Degard soldiers screamed in terror, realizing they were all going to die and begging their comrades to run away. Ghislaine ordered a full charge, knowing that while the enemy was confused, They had the perfect chance to overwhelm them all. He locked eyes with the massive structures in the distance, resolving to bring down the siege towers himself. The mercenaries followed Ghislaine's lead, shouting to crush the amateur invaders. An enemy knight sneered at them, mockery in his voice as he claimed turning one's back on the battlefield was foolish. He ordered his spearmen to block the front and stop the charge. The spearmen complied, leveling their long weapons in a lethal forest of steel. Ghislaine didn't slow down. Instead, he commanded his men to dodge the attacks on their own. He stood up in his stirrups and launched himself into the air, his horse leaping over the wall of spears. The enemy looked up in confusion, wondering where he had gone, just as Ghislaine descended like a reaper. He landed in the center of their formation, his sword unleashed in a devastating horizontal arc. Heads and torsos were severed in a single motion, leaving a circle of corpses around him as he pushed forward. Ghislaine glanced at the battlements, noting that the fortress wall was in even worse condition than he initially thought. He worried that at this rate, the wall would fall before the enemy even made it through the gate. He knew the Allied cavalry was keeping the center at bay for now, but the sheer difference in numbers was too vast. If the fight dragged on, they would eventually be surrounded. The enemy commanders shouted for their men to stop the young lord, claiming it didn't matter if they killed him as long as they kept him trapped there. Ghislaine ignored them, knowing there was no time to waste. To secure their win before they lost momentum, he had to take out the siege towers. He sprinted toward the massive wooden structure while enemy archers desperately fired at him, shouting for their comrades to not let him get close. Ghislaine ducked and weaved through the arrow fire, closing the distance in seconds. He jumped high into the air, extending his hand as a beam of blue mana shot out. He utilized a mana thread to grapple the top of the siege tower, using the tension to launch himself even higher. The enemy soldiers watching from below were stunned, whispering that the boy was actually flying. Ghislaine reached the peak of the tower and channeled every ounce of his mana into his blade. He slammed the weapon down into the structural center, and with a deafening roar of splintering wood, the entire siege tower collapsed under the weight of his strike. The Degard forces watched in absolute disbelief as pure muscle and mana dismantled their greatest weapon. Victor, watching from a distance, acknowledged that the man must be the enemy commander. He turned to his lieutenant and asked if the main gate had been breached yet. The soldier reported that the gate's defenses were stronger than expected and they were being delayed by internal resistance, but estimated they could break through in 10 minutes. Victor's voice was like cold steel as he told the man to make it 5. He promised to take out the enemy commander himself and warned the soldier that if they failed to open the gate by the time he returned, they would die by his hand. Victor began to ride toward Ghislaine, but his path was suddenly blocked by a puff of dust. Kaur sat atop his horse, a manic grin on his face as he addressed the flying tin can. He told Victor that he wasn't going anywhere and introduced himself as Kaur, the commander of the Regressed Mercenaries. He drew his massive curved sword, the blade catching the firelight as he invited the Silver Knight to play. He spurred his horse into a full gallop, the steel of his weapon catching the firelight as he swung a heavy blow toward the silver-armored knight. Victor let out a dismissive huff and redirected the force of the strike with one hand, causing Kaur's horse to stumble and crash into the dirt in a cloud of dust. Kaur lunged from the air, abandoning his mount to launch a flurry of high-speed slashes that were all met with the immovable block of Victor's broadsword. Sweat beaded on Kaur's forehead as his teeth chattered with effort, his eyes widening in shock as he realized the man had managed to block every single strike without breaking a sweat. Victor mocked the effort, stating that he had met a ton of people like him, simple, mediocre mercenaries who relied entirely on brute force. He shoved Kaur back with overwhelming strength, telling him there was nothing easier to deal with than beasts who simply swung their front paws instinctually. Kaur went skidding across the ground, coughing and bleeding as he acknowledged that the bastard was truly strong, just as his captain had predicted. In a quiet moment before the raid, Ghislaine had warned Kaur about this man, identifying him as Victor, the hidden joker card of the Desmond family. He explained that Victor was one of the key powers rooting for the fall of Perdium and warned Kaur that the knight was stronger than anyone he had ever faced, save for Ghislaine himself. Ghislaine predicted that the enemy would use their overwhelming numbers to pin their forces to the walls, allowing Victor to break through the weakened gate and launch an all-out assault. Everything was playing out exactly as Ghislaine planned, but there was one critical risk. If Victor made it out of the castle gate, the plan would fail in the worst-case scenario. Ghislaine had looked at the red-haired captain and told him he needed him to hold Victor down at all costs. Kaur had laughed roughly, remarking that the young lord was asking for too much, yet he gripped his sword tighter, ready to fulfill the command. While Kaur struggled, Gillian was a whirlwind of blue mana at the Degard main camp. His massive axe cleaved through the enemy ranks as he commanded his men to reduce their numbers as much as possible, warning them not to get in his way. The enemy knight, Adden, watched with growing frustration as Gillian's shield took attacks from all angles, realizing he couldn't pierce through the old man's defense. He wondered when was the last time he had encountered someone so sturdy, but Gillian didn't give him time to ponder. Stating he had no more time to waste on him, the veteran mercenary captain brought his axe down with a singular command for the knight to fall. The ground shattered under the impact as the Degard forces were thrown into total disarray. Back at the castle, the silence of the courtyard was broken by the frantic shouts of Alfoy, who screamed that the enemy was getting past the gate. He turned his anger toward Vanessa, who was seated in a glowing magic circle, accusing her and Ghislaine of stealing their mana while doing nothing to stop the breach. Vanessa remained motionless, her eyes glowing a brilliant sapphire as she whispered that it was not yet time, pleading for just a little more power. The massive wooden gates groaned and finally gave way, or was rather torn down as it exploded inward. Victor led the charge through the opening, his sword bloodied as he shouted for all soldiers to attack and take over the castle. He ordered his men to bring Count de Garde forward while he personally went to eliminate the Per Diem commanders. His path was once again blocked by the battered figure of Kaur. Victor paused, asking if the mercenary captain didn't know when to discard his life. He told Kaur to look at the wreckage of the torn-down gate and accept that he had already lost. He lectured him on the fatal mistake of letting mercenaries decide the fate of a family, claiming that no matter how skilled they were, they could never defeat a highly trained knight. He urged Kaur to run while he still could, stating there was nothing in this war worth throwing his life away for. Kaur laughed in his face, asking so what if they were mercenaries or knights. He spat out that on the battlefield, the only thing that mattered was winning or losing. Gillian suddenly arrived like a thunderclap from behind, his axe glowing with a violet light. He utilized the inside hook of his blade to catch Victor's guard, pulling the knight toward him with a grunt of exertion. Victor was staggered by the strength of the wretched mercenary, but Gillian's single blue eye met his through the visor. The veteran warrior declared that even the sturdiest defense had a gap and reminded himself that he had already offered his life to the young lord to serve as his weapon. He vowed to bring Ghislaine nothing but victory. Kaur charged forward alongside the old captain, knowing he might die against such a foe, but determined to land just one terminal strike that would change the course of the war. His mind drifted back to a quiet evening at a campfire with Ghislaine, where he had asked the young lord about the bet they once had. Kaur had been mesmerized by how Ghislaine had moved, simply going bam, bam, and dodging every single one of his attacks. When Kaur asked if he could be taught how to do that, Ghislaine had looked at him calmly and explained that it wasn't about the specific movement. The young master noted that anyone running into Kaur for the first time would likely look down on him, seeing him as nothing more than a wild animal that simply charged forward without a thought. Back in the present, Victor watched the mercenaries approach with blatant disdain. He mocked Kaur, stating that fools like him always made such hasty decisions in moments of desperation, entirely oblivious to the fact that it might be the very last decision of their lives. Victor raised his broadsword and issued a cold command for the mercenary to simply die. However, Ghislaine's past advice echoed in Kaur's mind, reminding him that if he could hide his true intentions within that reckless movement, it would be more than enough to land his blow. As Victor swung a lethal arc intended to end the fight, Kaur executed an irregular, jarring movement that caught the blade Victor had intended to deflect. In a sudden, violent burst of motion, Kaur bypassed the knight's guard and drove his weapon deep into the neck of Victor's warhorse. The beast let out a pained scream as blood sprayed across Kaur's face, and both knight and mount were sent crashing into the dirt. Victor stood amidst the dust, analyzing the exchange with a growing sense of intrigue. He realized that the irregular movement was actually careful groundwork meant to shift an extremely disadvantageous situation into the mercenary's favor. He recognized this as a caliber of skill that only those truly prepared to face death could reach, admitting that Kaur was perhaps not as thoughtless as he had initially gauged. Standing over the bloodied mercenary, Victor called the effort excellent, noting that while it was common for warriors to surpass their limits at the crossroads of life and death, Kaur had unfortunately missed his mark. He told Kaur he had simply met the wrong opponent and asked if he had any last words. Kaur looked up with a bloody smirk and gasped out the word, "You." Victor was momentarily confused until a sudden whistle of air forced him to leap backward. A set of jagged mana threads and throwing daggers slammed into the ground where he had just been standing. Belinda dropped from the sky like a bird of prey, her silver hair catching the firelight. She snagged Kaur with her threads and hauled him onto the back of her passing horse, making a swift escape. Victor stared at his fallen steed, processing the fact that he had lost his mount because of that one singular strike. He realized that while the mercenary would have died without the woman's help, he hadn't been foolish enough to trade his life for a horse. He understood the grim reality of the situation. Kaur's entire suicidal assault was worth risking his life for just to hold Victor down in that specific spot. High atop the castle battlements, the defenders watched as the de Garde forces began to funnel through the breached gate. The mages in the courtyard were in a state of terminal panic, especially Alfoy, who screamed that since Ghislaine had taken their mana, he needed to do something before they were all killed. Vanessa, seated at the center of the glowing magic circle, ignored the insults. She reached out toward the sky, remembering Ghislaine's words to her on the wall. He had promised her that even when the enemies reached their very noses after breaching the gate, the situation could be flipped to their advantage with her magic. When she had doubted herself, he had looked her in the eye and told her he knew she could do it. With a resolute expression, Vanessa unleashed her power, screaming the name of the spell, Flame Strike. A gargantuan pillar of orange and blue fire erupted from the ground beneath the entrance, incinerating the tunnel and the soldiers within it. The massive explosion sent a shockwave through the castle, followed by a torrent of white-hot flames that poured out of the gateway. Ghislaine watched the destruction from his position near the Duke, his eyes cold as the enemy's advance was halted by the inferno. The de Garde soldiers outside the gate screamed in agony as they were scorched, desperately calling for help as their ranks broke and they began to retreat in a blind frenzy. Ghislaine didn't give them a moment to breathe. Pointing his blade at the fleeing army and commanding his forces to surround the castle gate, he bellowed for them not to let a single one escape. Victor stood alone amidst the smoldering ruins and charred corpses of his own men, his silver armor now blackened by soot. He grumbled about how irritating the situation had become, reflecting on how this war had been meticulously planned through long, behind-the-scenes preparation to block every path Perdium could take. He realized that the presence of special forces like the Mad Dog Kaur and an elder-class mage capable of incinerating thousands in an instant were far too convenient to be mere coincidences. He acknowledged that everything had been perfectly aligned to thwart his victory and accepted the fact that he had fallen right into a carefully laid trap. Victor sheathed his weapon and ordered the surviving soldiers to assemble for a temporary retreat. He reasoned that as long as they got out of the blaze, they could regroup at the main camp, even if it took longer to capture the castle than planned. He began to call for his knight, Adnan, but he was interrupted by a massive, looming figure. Gillian stepped out of the smoke, his white beard stained with grime and a massive axe resting on his shoulder. He carried a severed, bloodied helmet in his other hand and asked if Victor was the commander of the guard. Gillian looked at the Silver Knight with a gaze of absolute ice and asked if he was looking for Adnan, before casually dropping the severed head of the enemy knight into the dirt. He informed Victor that his main force and his entire army were already done for, telling him to surrender. Victor let out a low, dark laugh that escalated into a roar of defiance. He told Gillian not to make him laugh, questioning if the old man really thought his war would end this way. He declared that all he had to do was cut off every one of their heads by himself. Victor's mana erupted in a violent blue aura as he gripped his sword, announcing to the blood-soaked field that his true war had only just begun.